The gaslight flickers in the servants' passage long after the drawing-room above has gone still. The house is quiet, but not asleep. Somewhere below the stairs, a door closes too softly. Footsteps pause. A breath is held. In Victorian homes, silence was not emptiness. It was discipline. It was surveillance. It was survival. If you enjoy slow, atmospheric history like this, take a moment to subscribe and stay with me and tell me where you're listening from tonight. These stories were never meant to be told out loud, and you're not meant to hear them alone. Victorian servants were trained to disappear, to move through rooms without leaving echoes, to see everything and say nothing. Yet they lived closer to truth than the families they served. They heard confessions never meant for clergy. They cleaned bedrooms before lies had time to fade. They knew which marriages were performances, which children were unspoken mistakes, and which visitors arrived only after the lamps were turned low. This was a hidden society beneath respectability, a world of strict rules, quiet defiance, forbidden relationships, stolen moments of rest, and secrets heavy enough to ruin lives. Above the stairs, order, morality, appearances. Below them, exhaustion, intimacy, danger, and knowledge. Tonight, we descend into that unseen world where Victorian servants lived full lives no one was supposed to notice, and where the house revealed its truest self only after dark. The back door was never meant to be noticed. It did not face the street, did not catch the sun, did not wear polish or brass. It opened onto alleys, yards, and narrow service lanes where mud gathered and light arrived late, if at all. This was where service began, not ceremonially, not with greetings, but with instructions already assumed. To enter here was to accept a different rhythm of the house, one measured not in hours, but in summons. After dusk, that door became something else entirely. The family upstairs retired behind velvet and lamplight, convinced the day had ended. Yet below, the house tightened rather than relaxed. Shadows lengthened along the stone floor. Footsteps softened. Voices lowered into a register shaped by caution. The work did not stop when the bells grew silent. It merely changed its nature. Servants learned early that night revealed truths daylight obscured. In the dim corridors beneath the stairs, the rules bent. Not openly, never recklessly, but enough to allow breath. A maid lingered an extra moment by the sink, hands resting in water that had gone lukewarm. A footman paused at the end of the passage, listening not for orders but for the sound of another moving nearby. These were not rebellions. They were necessary pauses in lives governed by constant attention. The house itself behaved differently after dark. Wood settled with long sighs. Pipes ticked faintly behind walls. The scent of coal smoke deepened, mixing with soap, starch, and the faint sweetness of leftovers hidden for later. It was in these hours that the servants felt the building most keenly, not as a workplace, but as a living structure that knew their names better than those who owned it. Entering through the back door meant surrendering privacy in exchange for shelter. The servants belonged to the house, but the house did not belong to them. They slept within it, ate within it, labored within it, yet never moved freely through its grand spaces. Upstairs rooms were territories crossed only when summoned, and always with purpose. Below stairs, however, the corridors belonged to them, narrow, low-ceilinged, humming with suppressed life. At night, those corridors carried stories, not told aloud, rarely finished, often exchanged through glances rather than words. Everyone knew who was ill, who had been dismissed without warning, who had cried quietly while folding linen. The knowledge passed invisibly, carried on routine and repetition. Nothing was written down. Nothing needed to be. The back door also marked the boundary of morality as the household understood it. Upstairs, virtue was displayed and discussed, arranged carefully like furniture. Downstairs, morality was practical. It meant keeping one's position, avoiding notice, protecting others when possible, knowing when silence was safer than honesty. Servants learned quickly that truth, like light, could burn if mishandled. Some evenings, long after the family slept, the servants gathered briefly where they could by the scullery hearth, near the pantry door, at the foot of the stairs. These moments were not social in the way the drawing room imagined society. They were utilitarian, fragile, shaped by exhaustion. A shared glance, a whispered remark, a breath released, then movement again, because stillness invited risk. Outside, the city breathed differently too. Carriages passed less frequently. Footsteps echoed longer on stone. Somewhere beyond the walls, other servants entered other houses through other back doors, repeating the same ritual, living parallel lives never acknowledged in newspapers or portraits. An entire population moved through shadows, sustaining the visible world while remaining deliberately unseen. This was how service began each night, not with drama, but with quiet continuation. The back door closed, the latch caught, and the house, reassured by obedience, allowed its hidden life to persist beneath the stairs, where no one was meant to look and everyone learned to see. Invisibility was not a side effect of service, it was the goal. From the first morning a servant tied an apron or buttoned a jacket, they were taught not simply how to work, but how to vanish while doing so. Movement was to be efficient but quiet. Presence was to be useful but unremarkable. To be noticed was to have failed. The training was subtle, delivered not through lectures but through correction. A glance held too long, a step too heavy on the stair, a breath released at the wrong moment. Each mistake was met with a look, a pause, a tightening of the mouth from someone higher in the hierarchy. Lessons were learned quickly, because comfort depended on it, employment depended on it. Survival, often, depended on it. Servants learned to measure rooms not by beauty but by sightlines, where mirrors reflected, where doors opened, where the family's attention drifted during conversation. They memorized these patterns the way others memorized prayers. A maid could cross a room without disturbing a sentence. A footman could stand within arm's reach and remain unseen. This was not natural talent. It was discipline refined by repetition. The family believed this invisibility was effortless, that servants simply did not possess the same weight as other people. Their presence registered only when a task was unfinished or a rule broken. Otherwise, they blended into the architecture, another fixture, another function, as expected and unexamined as the walls themselves. Below the stairs, however, invisibility was understood differently. It was labor. It required constant awareness, constant restraint, to suppress expression, irritation, fatigue, to swallow words before they formed, to keep the face neutral even when the body ached. A servant's inner life had no place in the household's performance of order. Children were often the first to disrupt this illusion. They noticed what adults had trained themselves not to see. A young hand tugging at a skirt, a question asked too loudly, "Who are you?" The answer was never simple. A servant was expected to smile, to redirect, to disappear again before curiosity hardened into recognition. Parents corrected children gently, teaching them the same lesson: do not look too closely. The cost of invisibility accumulated slowly. Days blurred, weeks folded into one another. Without acknowledgement, time lost its markers. Birthdays passed unmarked. Illness went untreated until it interfered with work. Grief was managed privately, often alone, because there was no sanctioned space for it. Servants learned to carry their lives inside themselves, compacted and silent. Even language reflected this erasure. Servants were referred to by role rather than name: cook, maid, boy, girl. Individuality complicated obedience. Names invited attachment. Attachment invited sympathy, and sympathy disrupted hierarchy. Better to keep identities flattened, interchangeable, replaceable. Yet invisibility was never complete. The house depended too heavily on those it refused to see. A missing hand was noticed immediately. A delayed meal caused irritation. A fire left untended drew alarm. In these moments, servants became briefly visible not as people, but as problems to be solved. Once resolved, they faded again. Some learned to exploit this rhythm. They understood when the family's attention waned, when oversight loosened. In those brief intervals, a servant might rest against a wall a moment longer than permitted, might pocket a crust of bread, might exchange a look with another that carried more meaning than words ever could. These acts were small, but they mattered. Invisibility shaped relationships between servants as well. Alliances formed quietly, often without explicit agreement. A shared understanding passed between those who had mastered the same disappearances. They recognized one another by posture, by timing, by the way they moved through space without disturbing it. This was a language outsiders could not hear. To live unseen was to exist in suspension, present but unacknowledged, essential yet ignored. The house thrived on this contradiction. Its calm depended on the labor of those trained to remove themselves from view. And so the servants continued, perfecting their erasure, sustaining a world that refused to look back at them, even as it relied on their every breath. The bell was the true master of the house, not the man who owned it, nor the woman who managed its appearances, but the thin wire that ran unseen through walls and floors, ending in a small metal mouth that could speak command at any hour. When it rang, nothing else mattered. A hand froze mid-scrub. A bite was swallowed unfinished. Sleep thinned instantly into readiness. Each bell had its own voice. Servants learned them as one learns weather by tone, by urgency, by the place from which they sounded. A sharp pull from the dining room demanded speed and composure. A faint tremor from an upstairs chamber meant patience and restraint. Some bells rang insistently, others once, as if testing whether obedience still existed. All were to be answered. Time, for servants, was not kept by clocks. It was kept by anticipation. The bell might ring at any moment, and therefore every moment belonged to it. Even in rest, the body stayed partially alert, muscles prepared to rise, to move, to perform. True leisure did not exist within earshot of that sound. The bell controlled movement as thoroughly as walls. It dictated when a servant might enter a room and when they must retreat. It decided which conversations could finish and which would be cut short. It could summon without explanation, dismiss without gratitude. Its authority required no justification because it was built into the structure of the house itself. Servants developed strategies around it. They positioned themselves close enough to respond quickly, but not so close as to appear idle. They learned how to arrive just after the bell, not immediately too eager, suggested nothing else was being done, but not too late, which invited suspicion. Timing became a delicate negotiation, refined through experience and observation. At night, the bell took on a different character. Its ring felt louder in the dark, sharper against tired nerves. A pull after midnight meant discomfort, irritation, or secrecy. A glass of water, a misplaced object, a restlessness that could not be named. Servants climbed stairs softly, carrying light with them, careful not to wake others who would not be called. The bell also created division. Those closest to it, footmen, ladies' maids, lived under constant summons, while others further below experienced longer stretches between calls. This proximity conferred status but also burden. To be nearest was to be most controlled. Privilege and exhaustion walked together. Occasionally, the bell rang without purpose, a nervous pull, a moment of boredom, a test of presence. Servants answered anyway. They always did. The possibility that it might mean nothing did not reduce its power. Unanswered bells were remembered. Patterns were noted. A reputation could be damaged by a single missed call. In rare moments, the bell failed. A wire loosened. A mechanism jammed. When this happened, confusion rippled through the house. Masters shouted. Servants moved without instruction, improvising their roles. These moments revealed how much order depended on that small sound, how fragile the illusion of control truly was. Servants spoke of the bell quietly among themselves, sometimes with bitterness, sometimes with grim humor. It was joked about as if it were alive, as if it listened back. No one mocked it too openly. Even below stairs, caution remained. The bell did not care who was ill, who was grieving, who had slept only an hour. It rang the same regardless. Its metal voice flattened all human variation into a single demand, come. And so servants oriented their lives around it, shaping days and nights into readiness. The bell ruled not by cruelty alone, but by certainty. It would ring. It always did. And when it did, everything else, thought, feeling, self, fell away, leaving only motion in service of a house that never questioned its own right to call. Sleep, for servants, was never a single thing. It arrived in pieces, retreated without warning, and returned only when permitted. Nights were not a long rest, but a corridor of interruptions, measured by footsteps on stairs and the ever-present possibility of summons. To sleep deeply was a risk. To sleep lightly was a skill learned over time. Beds below stairs were narrow and practical, placed where space allowed rather than where comfort suggested. They stood in attics with slanted ceilings, in basements where damp crept along the walls, in shared rooms where breath and movement belonged to many at once. Privacy was rare. Darkness was incomplete. Even in rest, the house pressed in. Servants learned to fall asleep quickly because they had to. There was no luxury of easing into rest, no lingering over thoughts. Exhaustion did the work instead, pulling consciousness down abruptly. A maid might close her eyes, still holding the shape of a folded sheet in her hands. A footman slept with boots within reach, ready to rise before his name was fully spoken. Night duty fractured rest further. Someone always remained alert. Fires had to be watched, doors secured, lamps extinguished and relit. In larger houses, servants took turns staying half awake, listening for movement above. These shifts were not generous. They were layered onto already long days, turning fatigue into a permanent condition. The body adapted in small, unkind ways. Dreams shortened. Sleep became shallow. Waking no longer startled, it arrived as an extension of readiness. Over time, servants lost track of what uninterrupted rest felt like. Morning came less as renewal and more as continuation. Illness complicated this rhythm but rarely altered it. A servant might sleep with a fever and rise still to work, knowing absence invited replacement. Coughs were muffled into pillows. Pain was negotiated quietly, shifted from limb to remain bearable. Only collapse excused rest, and collapse carried consequences. Shared sleeping quarters created their own tensions. Snoring, muttering, sudden waking, all were endured. No one complained openly. Fatigue stripped tempers thin, but expression remained dangerous. Arguments were rare and brief, resolved by necessity rather than reconciliation. Everyone needed what little rest they could steal. There were moments, late at night, when sleep felt almost intimate, when the house finally settled, when the pipes stilled and the wind softened outside. In these moments, servants lay awake not because they were needed, but because stillness itself felt unfamiliar. The body, trained for response, resisted peace. Some prayed before sleeping, others counted tasks for the morning ahead. Some thought of places far from the house, villages left behind, streets remembered, people no longer present. These thoughts were both comfort and ache. Sleep, when it came, blurred them into brief, indistinct images that dissolved too quickly to hold. Morning arrived early, often before the sun. Bells rang, footsteps resumed. The cycle tightened again. There was no sense of having rested, only of having paused. Servants rose with practiced efficiency, smoothing bedding they would barely remember using. Sleep in shifts shaped servants' understanding of time. Days and nights lost distinction. Life became a continuum of effort, punctuated by brief unconsciousness. This was not considered cruelty by the household above. It was efficiency. The house required readiness, and readiness demanded sacrifice. And so servants lived in fragments of sleep, of rest, of self. Their exhaustion was invisible, folded into routine. Above stairs, the family spoke of comfort and repose. Below, servants learned to exist without either, mastering a form of rest that never truly belonged to them, yet kept them standing all the same. The uniform was presented as protection, clean cloth, proper appearance, a mark of belonging, yet from the moment it was issued, it carried a quieter purpose, one not spoken aloud, but understood through wear. It shaped the body before it ever touched the mind. Servants dressed not for comfort, but for compliance. Fabric was chosen for durability, not ease. Aprons starched until they resisted movement. Collars tightened to enforce posture. Shoes stiff enough to remind the wearer of every step. These garments did not merely cover the body, they instructed it. How to stand, how to bend, how to occupy space without claiming it. A servant learned their uniform the way one learned the house through friction. Sleeves caught on corners, skirts restricted stride, jackets held shoulders in position long after muscles ached. Over time, the body adapted, conforming to the clothing's demands. Natural movement softened into something narrower, more contained. The uniform trained restraint through repetition. Uniforms also erased difference. Hair was pinned, jewelry forbidden, personal preference eliminated. Two maids, different in age, temperament, history, were rendered nearly identical once dressed. This sameness was intentional. Individuality complicated authority, uniformity simplified command. The household took comfort in this visual order. A line of servants presented itself as efficiency made visible. The uniform reassured the family that roles were understood, boundaries respected. It created distance even in proximity. One could speak over a servant in uniform more easily than to a person dressed as oneself. Below stairs, the uniform carried another meaning. It marked rank among servants themselves. A lady's maid's attire differed subtly from that of a housemaid. A footman's livery announced proximity to power. These distinctions mattered deeply. They determined access, authority, and vulnerability. A change in uniform could elevate or diminish a life overnight. Uniforms were issued, maintained, and inspected. A stain was not merely dirt, it was failure. A crease out of place suggested carelessness. Servants spent hours keeping garments immaculate, often cleaning their own uniforms late at night after tending to everyone else's needs. Their appearance was expected to remain perfect, regardless of circumstance. There were moments when the uniform felt like armor. It provided legitimacy within the household. It allowed entry into spaces otherwise forbidden. It offered a kind of invisibility. People addressed the role, not the wearer. This could be a relief, to be shielded from scrutiny by expectation. But armor weighs on the body. At the end of the day, removing the uniform felt like shedding a second skin. Some servants lingered over this act, folding garments carefully, delaying the return to themselves. Others undressed quickly, eager to escape the posture and pressure it enforced. Occasionally, uniforms were altered quietly. A loosened seam, a softened collar, a shoe broken in just enough to ease pain. These adjustments were small rebellions, rarely noticed, deeply necessary. They restored a fragment of bodily autonomy in a life otherwise governed by instruction. The uniform followed servants beyond the house. When sent on errands, they moved through streets, marked visibly as belonging to someone else. Their clothing announced service to strangers. Respect varied. Some stepped aside, others ignored them entirely. The uniform spoke before the servant could. Even in death, the uniform lingered. Servants who died in service were sometimes buried wearing it, as if their role had outlived their body. Identity flattened into function, preserved through cloth. The uniform restrained not only movement, but possibility. It reminded servants daily of who they were allowed to be and who they were not. It was worn, endured, and maintained with care, not because it honored them, but because survival required it. And so each morning, servants dressed themselves into obedience, button by button, seam by seam, preparing their bodies to disappear once more into the ordered life of the house. Below the stairs, equality was an illusion no one believed in. Service did not flatten difference, it multiplied it. Power flowed downward in narrow channels, dividing servants from one another with almost as much precision as the family was divided from them. Rank mattered. It determined who spoke, who listened, who commanded, and who endured. At the top of this hidden order stood the housekeeper and the butler, figures of authority, whose allegiance leaned upward as much as downward. They enforced rules handed to them, but they also interpreted them, deciding how strictly they would be applied and to whom. Their approval could soften a reprimand or sharpen it into dismissal. They were intermediaries, and intermediaries wielded quiet power. Beneath them, the hierarchy branched. Ladies' maids and valets occupied a peculiar space close to the family, privy to their habits, yet never permitted to forget their place. Their proximity elevated them in status among servants, but it also exposed them to greater scrutiny. A mistake made close to power carried heavier consequences. Trust was conditional and easily withdrawn. Cooks ruled their own territories. The kitchen was both workplace and domain, governed by its own rhythms and rules. A good cook commanded respect that extended beyond rank, because hunger was persuasive. Even the housekeeper tread carefully here. The cook's favor mattered. Displeasure traveled quickly through meals, subtly altered or delayed. Housemaids, scullery maids, and general servants occupied the broad base of the structure. Their labor was constant, physical, and often unnoticed. They rose earliest and rested last. Among them, seniority created its own pecking order. The older maid instructed the younger, the experienced corrected the new. Kindness existed, but so did impatience. Exhaustion narrowed tolerance. Footmen navigated a different ladder altogether, one shaped by appearance and presentation. Height, posture, and manner mattered. A footman's value could be assessed at a glance. Advancement depended not only on competence, but on how well one fit the image the household wished to project. This knowledge bred competition, often silent but intense. These divisions were reinforced daily through routine. Who served meals, who cleaned rooms, who answered bells, who spoke when spoken to. The rules were rarely written, yet everyone knew them. Violations were corrected swiftly, sometimes cruelly, often without explanation. To question hierarchy was to invite suspicion. Yet below stairs, alliances formed across rank. A cook might protect a scullery maid, a valet might pass information quietly. These relationships were built on necessity rather than sentiment. Mutual reliance softened boundaries just enough to allow survival. Trust was cautious, earned slowly, and revoked quickly if betrayed. Conflict simmered constantly. Envy moved easily through confined spaces. Resentment grew where authority felt arbitrary. A favored servant inspired quiet bitterness. A reprimand delivered publicly left a residue that lingered long after words faded. Arguments were rare but sharp, erupting suddenly and ending abruptly, because time and energy were too scarce to waste. The hierarchy also determined who was blamed. When something went wrong, fault flowed downward until it settled on the least powerful. A broken dish, a missed instruction, a mislaid object. Responsibility was assigned according to rank, not truth. Those at the bottom learned to accept this as part of the arrangement. Despite this, ambition persisted. Servants watched one another closely, noting shifts in favor, changes in responsibility. Advancement was possible, though rare. A promotion altered not only duties but identity. It changed how one was addressed, where one stood, who deferred. These changes mattered deeply. They were among the few measurable successes available. The hierarchy below stairs mirrored the one above, but lacked its comforts. It was strict, intimate, and unforgiving. Everyone knew where they stood, and everyone knew how easily that position could be lost. And so the servants moved within their own ordered world, navigating power that pressed from above and below, learning to survive not just the family they served, but the invisible structure that governed their lives in shadow. The house gave the impression of stillness only to those who did not belong to it. From the outside, it settled each evening into a posture of calm, curtains drawn, lamps dimmed, doors closed against the cold. To the family, this signaled rest. To the servants, it marked a shift rather than an end. Below stairs, motion continued long after the drawing room emptied. Dishes clinked softly in water gone grey with use. Floors were swept where footsteps would never return before morning. Fires were banked carefully, coaxed into endurance rather than brilliance. The house did not sleep. It exhaled, adjusted, prepared itself to be perfect again by dawn. Servants moved through this late labor with practiced quiet. Voices dropped. Shoes were loosened or removed altogether. Every sound was measured against the sleeping rooms above. A dropped pan could carry farther at night. A careless step could echo up the stairwell. Mistakes after dark felt heavier, less forgivable, because they threatened the illusion that the house rested easily. There was always more to do. Bed linens required airing. Silver demanded polishing, even if it had already been cleaned that morning. Clothing worn only briefly was brushed and rehung as though untouched. The house insisted on renewal even when nothing appeared to have been disturbed. This insistence created a rhythm without pause. Some servants found a strange comfort in these hours. The family was absent in the most literal sense. Their presence lingered only as expectation, not interruption. Without eyes watching directly, movements loosened slightly. Shoulders dropped. Breaths deepened. It was still labor, but it was labor without performance. The house itself seemed different at night. Corridors narrowed. Shadows gathered in corners that daylight flattened. Familiar rooms felt altered, less decorative, more structural. Servants came to know the building as a body, listening to its creaks, sensing its moods, recognizing when weather or age shifted its balance. They knew which stair complained in winter, which door swelled in rain, which window rattled in high wind. This knowledge was never asked for, yet it was relied upon. When something went wrong, a leak, a draught, a smell of smoke, it was a servant who noticed first. The house communicated with them because they were always present. Their constant movement kept it alive, functional, respectable. Night also revealed the house's vulnerabilities. Rats moved where food had been left carelessly. Damp crept into walls unchecked by heat. Fires smoldered dangerously if neglected. Servants bore responsibility for these risks without acknowledgement. If the house failed, blame would fall on them, regardless of circumstance. Fatigue thickened these hours. Bodies slowed. Hands trembled slightly with wear. Servants learned to work through this, to override signals of rest. There was pride in endurance, but also quiet resentment. The house demanded more than it gave, and servants learned not to expect gratitude in return. Occasionally the work stretched until the early hours, leaving barely time to sleep before morning began again. In these moments, exhaustion blurred into something deeper. Time lost shape. The day ahead felt immediate, pressing in before the night had finished. Servants learned to exist in this compression, to live without clear boundaries between effort and rest. When finally the last lamp was extinguished and the final door secured, there was no ceremony, no acknowledgement that the house had been carried safely through another night. Servants retreated to their rooms quietly, knowing the pause would be brief. Above stairs, the family slept, believing the house rested with them. Below, servants lay awake, listening to its continued breathing, the soft crackle of dying embers, the settling of beams, the distant sounds of a city that never truly slept either. The house did not rest because it could not. Its stillness was an illusion sustained by those who moved unseen through its depths, ensuring that by morning it would appear effortless once more. Servants were taught early where to place their eyes. Downward, always. To look directly was to risk familiarity, and familiarity unsettled the order of things. A lowered gaze signaled obedience, discretion, and distance. Yet while eyes were trained to retreat, ears were sharpened. Listening was unavoidable. It was also dangerous. The architecture of the house ensured this. Sound traveled through floorboards and vents, along stairwells and behind walls. Conversations intended to be private carried farther than their speakers imagined. Laughter slipped downward. Arguments followed it. Servants absorbed these sounds not by choice, but by proximity. Silence, when it occurred, often said more than words. Servants learned to listen without reacting. A raised voice upstairs did not prompt visible response below. Tears heard through a closed door were met with continued work. To acknowledge what was overheard was to confirm awareness, and awareness threatened the fragile boundary between service and intrusion. Better to pretend deafness while remembering everything. Certain sounds became familiar markers, the particular rhythm of footsteps that signaled irritation, the scrape of a chair that meant a discussion had turned sour, the pause before a door closed that suggested something had been left unsaid. Servants read these cues instinctively, adjusting their movements accordingly. Timing became an act of self-preservation. There were rooms where listening was especially fraught. Bedrooms carried whispers, confessions, and despair. Dining rooms revealed tensions masked by etiquette. Studies held secrets spoken aloud only when doors were believed secure. Servants entered these spaces afterward, cleaning traces of moments never meant to be witnessed. They learned not to linger, but they could not unhear. Children, again, disrupted this discipline. They asked questions aloud, repeated phrases without understanding weight. A child might mimic an argument at breakfast, turning private words into public embarrassment. Servants watched these moments carefully, knowing how quickly blame could shift. Listening too well could become culpability. Among servants, listening served another function. Information passed quietly between them, rarely directly. A look exchanged in the corridor, a sentence left unfinished. Warnings delivered without detail. Everyone understood the value of knowing what could not be spoken. It allowed preparation, it allowed caution, it allowed survival. Yet, this knowledge carried burden. Servants held truths they could not act upon. They knew which marriages were brittle, which tempers were dangerous, which habits grew darker with time. They knew who drank too much, who prayed too loudly, who feared exposure. This awareness did not grant power. It deepened restraint. Occasionally, listening became leverage. A servant might hint at knowledge to protect themselves or another. Such moments were rare and risky. Retaliation was swift if suspicion arose. Most servants chose silence. It was safer to be thought ignorant than informed. The act of listening also altered how servants perceived themselves. They lived inside other people's lives without acknowledgement, witnessing intimacy without participation. This proximity without agency distorted boundaries. Servants learned to separate what they knew from who they were, to carry secrets without letting them define them. At night, when the house quieted, echoes lingered, voices replayed themselves in memory, words gained weight without the distraction of labor. Some servants lay awake replaying conversations, wondering which truths would remain hidden and which might surface unexpectedly. Listening did not end when sound did. Eyes remained down even in memory. Servants did not allow themselves to judge openly. Judgment was a luxury reserved for those with power. Instead, they observed, catalogued, and continued working. The house required discretion above all else. In this way, servants became repositories of unspoken history. Their knowledge shaped their caution, their alliances, their endurance. They moved through the house with lowered gaze and sharpened hearing, carrying truths that would never be recorded, ensuring that the lives above remained intact no matter what had been heard along the way. Silence was not merely expected of servants. It was required. It was taught, enforced, and rewarded. From the first day of service, the lesson was clear. Words were liabilities. Speech invited attention. Attention invited judgment. And judgment, once formed, rarely softened. Servants learned quickly that silence protected them in ways obedience alone could not. A quiet servant was a safe servant, less likely to be blamed, less likely to be remembered, less likely to be questioned. Silence became a form of shelter, thin but dependable, worn like an inner garment beneath the uniform. This silence extended beyond the household. Servants did not speak freely even among themselves. Corridors carried sound too easily. Doors were rarely thick enough. Walls had ears, and those ears often belonged to someone with authority. Conversations were fragmented, held in motion, finished later or not at all. What was said mattered less than what was left unsaid. Silence also governed reaction. Servants were trained not to respond visibly to insult, contradiction, or cruelty. A raised eyebrow could be interpreted as defiance, a sigh as complaint. Even agreement, if offered too quickly, could appear insincere. Neutrality was safest. A blank expression preserved employment. When mistakes occurred, and they always did, silence determined outcome. A servant who protested risked dismissal. One who accepted blame without comment might survive. Fairness was not the goal. Order was. Silence maintained it. This discipline carried emotional cost. Anger had nowhere to go. Grief found no sanctioned outlet. Fear lingered unspoken, heavy, and unresolved. Servants absorbed these feelings inwardly, compressing them until they dulled or hardened. Over time, some lost the habit of speaking altogether, even when opportunity arose. Yet silence was not emptiness. It was active, deliberate. Servants used it to protect one another when possible. A missing detail, a forgotten name, a refusal to confirm suspicion. Silence could close ranks quietly, though never perfectly. Risk remained. Someone always listened too closely. Silence also shaped memory. Events unspoken faded differently. Without narration, moments dissolved into sensation rather than story. Servants remembered weight, sound, light, but not chronology. Their lives resisted telling because they had been lived without permission to articulate them. Occasionally, silence broke. A confession whispered too late. A truth spoken in exhaustion or anger. These moments were often regretted immediately. Words, once released, could not be gathered back. They traveled upward quickly, altered by retelling, sharpened into accusation. Silence, once broken, rarely forgave. The household relied on this silence without acknowledging it. Its reputation depended on it. Its stability rested on what servants did not say. The family trusted discretion instinctively, even as it denied servants agency or credit. Silence was assumed, not earned. For servants, silence became identity. It defined how they moved, how they endured, how they survived. Speech was rationed carefully, saved for moments that mattered, often moments no one else would ever hear about. In this way, silence functioned as both restraint and refuge. It limited expression, but it also concealed vulnerability. It allowed servants to exist within a system that offered little protection otherwise. And so they lived quietly, not because they lacked voices, but because they understood the cost of using them. Silence was not passivity, it was strategy, it was survival. Morality below stairs did not mirror the one displayed above. It could not afford to. The household spoke often of virtue of restraint, respectability, and proper conduct, yet those ideals were shaped by comfort and protection. Servants lived without either. Their sense of right and wrong formed under different pressures, guided less by doctrine than by consequence. Above stairs, morality was spoken aloud. It appeared in conversation, sermons, printed advice, and public reputation. Below, it was practiced quietly, adjusted daily, and rarely named. Servants learned that rules meant different things depending on who broke them. A master's indiscretion might be excused as weakness. A servant's mistake could end a livelihood. This imbalance reshaped judgment at its root. For servants, morality became situational. Loyalty mattered more than honesty. Discretion outweighed truth. Survival outranked purity. These were not cynical choices, they were necessary ones. A servant who revealed wrongdoing did not become virtuous. They became unemployed, disgraced, or worse. Silence, again, proved safer than righteousness. Kindness took unfamiliar forms. It was not always gentle. A cook might scold harshly to prevent a younger maid from repeating a mistake that would draw attention. A valet might mislead to protect another from suspicion. These acts violated the household's declared values, but upheld the servant's own. Protect one another when possible. Harm no one needlessly. Endure quietly. Rules were bent rather than broken outright. Food was taken, but never enough to be noticed. Time was stolen in minutes, not hours. Objects went missing only if their absence could be explained. Servants learned precisely how much could be taken without consequence. Excess invited punishment. Restraint maintained balance. Sex, too, was governed by this separate code. The household preached chastity and propriety, yet servants lived under constant proximity and strain. Relationships formed not from indulgence but from need, companionship, warmth, reassurance. These liaisons were hidden not out of shame, but prudence. Exposure carried risk beyond moral judgment. Dismissal, pregnancy, disappearance. Religious instruction filtered unevenly below stairs. Some servants held faith deeply, using it as solace. Others found it hollow, having seen how easily morality shifted in the presence of power. Prayers were whispered rather than proclaimed. Belief became personal, detached from the household's public piety. Justice, as imagined above stairs, rarely reached below intact. Servants understood this early. Fairness was unpredictable. Punishment often bore little relation to guilt. In response, servants recalibrated their sense of justice inwardly. They judged actions by outcome rather than intention. What mattered was not whether something was right, but whether it caused harm. Gossip operated under similar rules. Information was shared cautiously, often to warn rather than wound. Malice was discouraged not out of virtue, but self-preservation. A rumor could travel upward and return sharpened, cutting everyone it touched. Servants learned restraint, not because they were noble, but because they were vulnerable. This separate moral code was never written, never taught formally. It emerged organically from shared experience. New servants absorbed it quickly, guided by correction and example. Those who failed to learn it did not last long. Idealism proved fragile in a system that punished it. Above stairs, the household believed itself orderly, principled, respectable. Below, servants navigated a quieter ethic, one built on caution, loyalty, and endurance. It lacked the language of virtue, but it functioned. It kept people fed, sheltered, and most importantly, employed. In this hidden moral world, survival was not a failure of character. It was the measure of it. Servants did not claim virtue. They practiced something harder, living carefully within constraints that offered no mercy for idealism. Bedrooms were never private for long. Before the household woke, servants entered them quietly, carrying the morning with them. Curtains were drawn back an inch at a time, light admitted cautiously so as not to offend sleep. Fires were coaxed to life, basins filled. The room's night creased sheets, cooling air. The residue of dreams was erased with practiced efficiency. These rooms told stories without speaking. Servants learned to read them instinctively. A pillow shifted from its place, a chair pulled closer to the bed, a garment draped carelessly rather than folded. Each detail suggested something that had happened when the door was closed and voices were low. None of it was meant to be seen. All of it was seen. The work demanded precision. Beds were stripped and remade swiftly, linen aired, blankets smoothed into order. The transformation had to be complete before anyone noticed the room again. The bed, once rumpled with intimacy or restlessness, became an object of presentation, taut, symmetrical, obedient. Evidence vanished beneath clean surfaces. Servants handled the most personal objects without comment. Nightclothes damp with sweat or perfume. Letters left on bedside tables, sometimes unfinished. Medicines arranged with care or scattered in haste. These items were touched, moved, cleaned, returned, never acknowledged. Familiarity was inevitable. Familiarity was forbidden. Morning light revealed more than night concealed. Bruises noticed briefly and never mentioned. Tear-stained handkerchiefs folded away. Empty glasses that suggested sleeplessness rather than thirst. Servants absorbed these details without reaction. Their faces remained neutral, their movements steady. To betray recognition was to cross an invisible boundary. Some rooms felt heavier than others. Bedrooms where arguments lingered in the air long after voices had ceased. Rooms where illness clung stubbornly despite cleaning. Rooms where loneliness pressed against walls thick with wealth. Servants sensed these atmospheres without language, adjusting their pace accordingly, minimizing presence where pain felt raw. Children's rooms carried their own weight. Beds smaller, sheets tangled, toys abandoned mid-play. Servants restored order gently, aware that children noticed more than adults realized. A missing toy returned to its place before questions arose. A night accident handled discreetly, dignity preserved as much as possible. Protection extended downward here, though quietly. The timing mattered. Servants entered before the family woke, but not so early as to risk disturbance. They moved in calculated silence, mindful of floorboards and hinges that betrayed careless motion. Every action balanced speed against caution. The room had to be ready, immaculate, unmarked by labor. Occasionally, someone woke unexpectedly. A startled breath, a sudden question. Servants responded instantly, adjusting posture, voice, expression. Apologies offered without explanation. No acknowledgement of what had been seen. The room returned to belonging solely to its occupant, as though it had never been entered at all. Bedrooms demanded the deepest discretion because they held the most truth. What happened there shaped the household's surface calm. Servants bore responsibility for maintaining that calm, scrubbing away the night's disorder before it could be noticed. Their work protected reputations without receiving credit. This labor left residue. Servants carried fragments of others' lives with them, images glimpsed and forgotten deliberately. They learned not to assemble these fragments into narratives. Stories invited judgment. Judgment invited danger. Better to let details dissolve back into routine. By the time the household stirred, bedrooms stood transformed. Light lay evenly across polished surfaces. Beds bore no trace of use. The night had been neatly removed. Above stairs, the family woke, believing privacy intact. Below, servants continued working, having already crossed the most intimate threshold of the day and returned unseen, carrying with them the quiet knowledge of rooms that had told their secrets only briefly before morning. Required silence again. Late visitors arrived differently than daytime guests. They did not announce themselves with confidence or ceremony. Their knocks were softer, sometimes tentative, sometimes urgent in a way that avoided attention. Carriages waited at angles rather than directly before the door. Footsteps paused before committing to the threshold. These were arrivals, meant to be noticed by as few people as possible. Servants recognized them immediately. The rhythm was familiar. A glance exchanged in the corridor. A door opened just wide enough. Coats taken without comment. Names rarely spoken aloud. The house adjusted itself around these guests, absorbing them into its shadows. Such visits were handled with care. Lamps were lit only where necessary. Curtains remained drawn. Servants moved efficiently, creating warmth and privacy without display. The household above maintained its appearance of rest, while something else unfolded quietly within its walls. These visitors were not always strangers. Some returned often, known by posture rather than name. Others came only once, remembered afterward by the trace they left behind, a scent clinging to upholstery, a glass left unfinished, a room requiring more attention than usual the next morning. Servants noticed these things without asking why. Late visitors brought tension with them. Even when voices remained low, the air tightened. Servants sensed urgency, anticipation, sometimes fear. The house seemed to hold its breath. Doors closed gently but decisively. Staircases became barriers rather than passages. Quiet departures followed their own rules. A visitor leaving before dawn moved quickly, coat already in hand. Goodbyes were brief, often silent. Servants assisted without expression, opening doors before being asked, guiding guests through passages that avoided public view. The aim was efficiency, not acknowledgement. Timing mattered. A departure too early risked notice. Too late invited overlap with morning routines. Servants managed these margins carefully, coordinating movement with practiced instinct. They knew which floorboards betrayed weight, which doors groaned if opened too quickly. Their knowledge ensured discretion. Sometimes, departures left behind consequences. A room disturbed beyond routine use, bedding to be changed discreetly, items misplaced or forgotten. Servants restored order without inquiry, absorbing the additional labor without complaint. What mattered was not what had occurred, but that no trace remained. Not all late visitors came by choice. Messengers arrived with news best delivered after dark. Doctors called quietly to avoid alarm. Relatives appeared unexpectedly, carrying distress into a household unprepared to display it. These visits blurred the line between secrecy and necessity, yet the same discretion applied. Servants bore witness to these moments without context. They did not know motives, promises made, or arrangements settled behind closed doors. They saw only fragments, a hurried expression, a hand trembling slightly, a silence too long. These fragments were not assembled into understanding. Understanding was unnecessary and unsafe. Occasionally, a servant was addressed directly during such visits, asked to fetch something, to wait, to leave. These instructions were followed precisely, without curiosity. To ask questions would suggest interest, and interest implied judgment. Servants learned to withdraw their attention even while standing close. The household relied on this restraint. Its ability to maintain reputation depended on servants who could facilitate secrecy without participating in it. The family trusted discretion instinctively, even as it denied servants agency or acknowledgement. After a late visitor departed, the house returned to stillness slowly. Lamps were extinguished, doors secured. Servants lingered briefly, ensuring nothing remained out of place. Only then did they retreat below stairs, carrying with them the quiet residue of the encounter. These nights were not rare. They were part of the household's hidden rhythm, repeating often enough to feel ordinary, yet never spoken of openly. Servants understood that respectability required management, and management required silence. By morning, the house presented itself unchanged. Breakfast was served, conversations resumed, the night's arrivals and departures dissolved into routine. Only the servants remembered them, not as stories, but as labor performed quietly, ensuring that whatever had come and gone did so without consequence. Arguments in the household rarely announced themselves. They did not begin with raised voices or slammed doors, but with subtle shifts, pauses held too long, sentences shortened, footsteps sharpened with intent. Servants learned to recognize these early signs, adjusting their movements before conflict surfaced. Prevention mattered. Presence could escalate what silence might contain. Behind closed doors, the house absorbed sound differently. Voices pressed against wood and plaster, softened but not erased. Words traveled along corridors, filtered through walls, carried by vents and stairwells. Servants heard enough to understand tone, if not content. Anger had a texture. So did fear. So did exhaustion that tipped into accusation. The family believed privacy absolute once a door closed. Servants knew better. They moved quietly past these rooms, listening without appearing to listen, careful not to interrupt, yet alert to summons that might come abruptly. A bell rung mid-argument carried a particular edge. It demanded immediate response without explanation, placing servants briefly inside the aftermath of something unfinished. When voices rose, servants learned where to stand and where not to. Proximity could be misread as intrusion. Distance could appear neglectful. They navigated these moments with precision, remaining available without being visible. Their bodies learned this balance before their minds named it. Arguments took many forms. Some were sharp and brief, resolved quickly or deferred entirely. Others unfolded slowly, circling the same grievances with weary familiarity. Servants recognized these patterns over time. They knew which disputes would pass by morning and which would leave residue that altered the household's atmosphere for days. Certain rooms carried the weight of repeated conflict, studies where decisions were contested, bedrooms where silence replaced resolution, dining rooms where politeness masked resentment until it could no longer be contained. Servants cleaned these spaces afterward, smoothing surfaces that held emotional impressions long after words had faded. Children sensed these arguments even when they did not hear them directly. They became quieter, more watchful. Servants noticed this too, adjusting tone and routine to shield them where possible. Protection here was informal, offered without acknowledgement. It existed alongside obligation, not in place of it. Sometimes arguments turned physical, not always violently, but decisively. Objects moved, chairs scraped, doors were shut harder than necessary. Servants responded with heightened caution, prepared to intervene indirectly if needed. A knock delivered at the right moment, a task invented to create separation. These interventions were delicate and risky, offered only when necessary. The aftermath of arguments demanded additional labor. Broken items replaced quietly, rooms rearranged to restore order, meals adjusted to suit altered moods. Servants absorbed these changes without comment, smoothing transitions the family pretended had not occurred. Blame often followed conflict downward. A servant might be reprimanded for poor timing, for perceived incompetence, for nothing at all. Arguments unsettled hierarchy, and restoring it required visible correction. Servants accepted this with practiced restraint, understanding that fault needed somewhere to land. Despite this, servants developed their own interpretations. They recognized patterns of control, cruelty, and despair that repeated themselves regardless of outward respectability. These observations remained internal, shaping caution rather than action. Knowledge did not grant authority, it sharpened endurance. At night, when the house quieted again, echoes lingered. Servants carried these sounds with them, snatches of argument replayed involuntarily, tones remembered more vividly than words. Sleep came unevenly on such nights, disturbed by awareness that the morning would require composure, as if nothing had happened. Arguments behind closed doors were part of the household's unseen structure. They shaped relationships, routines, and expectations without appearing in public record. Servants bore witness not as participants, but as custodians of continuity, ensuring that conflict did not disrupt the appearance of order. By morning, doors opened again, voices softened, the house resumed its practiced calm. Servants continued their work, having already adjusted to the emotional debris left behind, quietly restoring balance in a place where disagreement was hidden, but never absent. There were children in the house whose presence was never acknowledged directly. Servants knew of them long before their names were spoken, if they were spoken at all. Knowledge arrived in fragments. A hurried preparation of a room previously unused, a cradle brought up from storage without explanation, a woman sent away suddenly and spoken of no more. These children existed in the margins, shaped by silence from the moment they drew breath. Some were born upstairs and moved quickly downward, removed from sight before their existence complicated the household's carefully managed image. Others arrived from elsewhere, carried in quietly at night, wrapped in blankets meant to conceal more than warmth. Servants received them without ceremony, understanding instinctively that questions were unwelcome. Infants cried differently when secrecy surrounded them, or perhaps servants imagined it so. The sound seemed sharper, more urgent, as if the child sensed its precarious position. These cries were answered swiftly below stairs, soothed before they could travel upward. Silence mattered. The house did not tolerate reminders of what should not have happened. Servants cared for these children with practiced gentleness. They fed them, bathed them, rocked them through restless nights. Affection developed naturally, though it remained unspoken. To grow attached invited grief, because such children rarely stayed. Their futures were decided elsewhere, beyond servants' control. Some were sent away to wet nurses or institutions, their departure marked only by an empty cot and the quiet removal of supplies. Others remained longer, hidden within the household under invented explanations. A distant relative's child, a temporary charge. The story shifted as needed. Servants memorized the current version and adjusted their behavior accordingly. As children grew, secrecy grew harder to maintain. Questions emerged first innocent, then insistent. Servants deflected gently, trained in distraction. Truth would only harm. These children learned early not to ask too much, absorbing the household's unspoken rules with unsettling speed. Servants noticed how these children watched, how they lingered at doorways, sensing exclusion without understanding it. They observed patterns of attention: who visited, who avoided them, who spoke with warmth and who with restraint. These observations shaped them quietly, imprinting a sense of conditional belonging. Occasionally, a child disappeared suddenly. Servants were told nothing, or offered explanations that satisfied no one. Illness, relocation, education elsewhere. The absence was handled swiftly, as though speed might prevent memory from settling. Servants adjusted routines, removed traces, and continued working. The emotional labor surrounding these children weighed heavily. Servants carried responsibility without authority, attachment without acknowledgement. They grieved privately, often alone, understanding that mourning openly would draw attention to what the household wished forgotten. These children represented the household's contradictions most starkly. They exposed the distance between declared morality and lived reality. Above stairs, propriety reigned. Below, consequences were managed quietly. Servants navigated this divide without language, guided by experience rather than instruction. Not all children born of secrecy were treated unkindly. Some received care, education, even affection, provided it remained discreet. Others faced neglect once usefulness faded. Outcomes varied, but the pattern remained. Their existence was conditional, their stories fragmented, their futures uncertain. Servants remembered them long after they were gone, not always by name but by impression: a small hand gripping a finger, a laugh muffled too quickly, a question never answered. These memories lingered without resolution. In the public life of the household, these children did not exist. In the quiet labor below stairs, they were deeply present. Servants learned to hold this contradiction. carrying the weight of lives that could not be acknowledged, ensuring that silence preserved appearances, even when it cost something deeply human. And so the house continued, immaculate and respectable, while servants bore witness to the most fragile truths, children who lived briefly in shadow, shaped by secrecy, and remembered only by those trained never to speak of them. The medicine cabinet occupied a curious place in the household. It was meant to signify care, responsibility, and modern sensibility, a small shrine to order amid the body's unpredictability. Bottles were labeled neatly, powders measured precisely. Everything appeared controlled, yet servants knew this cabinet was less about healing than management. Keys were kept carefully, usually by the mistress of the house or entrusted to a senior servant. Access was regulated, recorded, observed. Still, the cabinet emptied faster than illness alone could explain. Servants noticed this long before anyone spoke of it. Bottles refilled too often, glasses rinsed late at night. The faint, sweet odor that lingered where no tonic should have been needed. Victorian medicine was generous in its promises. Laudanum, morphine, chloral hydrate, these were not spoken of as dangers, but comforts, prescribed freely, offered politely, swallowed without suspicion. Servants watched their effects unfold gradually, not in dramatic collapse, but in subtle change. A hand that trembled less after a dose, a voice that softened unnaturally, sleep that arrived too easily and lasted too long. These medicines passed through servants' hands daily. They measured drops, prepared mixtures, delivered doses at prescribed hours or whenever requested. They learned which requests came too frequently, which instructions contradicted the doctor's advice. They followed orders regardless. To question medical authority was to overstep, and servants were trained never to overstep. Empty bottles accumulated quietly. Some were discarded immediately. Others were hidden away until replacement arrived, ensuring no interruption in supply. Servants understood that continuity mattered more than explanation. The household required smoothness above all else. Dependence rarely announced itself openly. It revealed itself in routine, the nightly request for something to help sleep, the morning headache requiring relief, the agitation that surfaced when the cabinet key could not be found quickly enough. Servants responded to these patterns with practiced calm, adjusting schedules, anticipating needs before they were voiced. Doctors visited and left, satisfied, prescriptions renewed, advice offered without concern. Servants observed the gap between clinical reassurance and lived reality. They saw how reliance deepened while language remained unchanged. This was not called addiction, it was called treatment. Women were especially vulnerable to this quiet dependence. Expected to remain composed, restrained, and pleasant, they turned to medicine as sanctioned relief. Servants recognized the signs, the softened focus, the delayed responses, the emotional flattening that followed repeated doses. They supported these women discreetly, ensuring appearances held. Men too relied on medicine, though often under different pretenses. Pain from injury, strain from work, nerves unsettled by responsibility. Servants noted how bottles meant for one purpose served another entirely. The cabinet's contents blurred into routine necessity rather than remedy. Occasionally, a bottle went missing. A servant might be blamed, suspicion landing easily on those closest to supply. These moments were tense. Accusation threatened livelihood. Most servants learned to document carefully, to remember quantities and times, to protect themselves from fault. Accuracy became armor. Servants spoke of the medicine cabinet quietly among themselves, with a mix of resignation and unease. They understood its role in maintaining household equilibrium. Without these substances, tempers flared more sharply, sleep fractured, moods became unpredictable. Medicine smoothed edges the household preferred not to confront directly. Yet servants also witnessed the cost. A mistress who grew distant from her own children, a master whose patience shortened despite increased dosage, the body adapting, requiring more to feel the same. These changes unfolded slowly enough to be dismissed, but servants noticed. They always did. The medicine cabinet remained closed to public scrutiny, its contents justified by authority and habit. Empty bottles were replaced, labels renewed, order preserved. Servants continued their role as quiet custodians of this delicate balance, delivering relief without comment, absorbing responsibility without credit. In this way, the cabinet became a symbol of Victorian restraint, turned inward, a sanctioned escape wrapped in medical language. And servants, once again, were entrusted with maintaining the illusion that everything remained under control, even as dependents settled quietly into daily life. Letters arrived, folded tight, edges worn by handling before they ever crossed the threshold. Some were delivered by post, sealed and stamped with respectable care. Others came by hand, passed quietly at the door, accepted without questions asked. Servants received them all the same way, with neutral expression, steady grip, and an instinctive understanding that paper could carry more danger than any spoken word. Ink was permanence made fragile. Once written, a letter could not be recalled. It could be hidden, destroyed, denied, but it could not be unwritten. Servants learned this quickly, because they were often the first to hold these messages and the last to decide their fate. Some letters were ordinary, invitations, confirmations, polite exchanges, meant to be seen and answered. Others announced themselves immediately as different. Their seals were broken too hastily. Their handwriting slanted with urgency. Their paper bore the faint crease of having been unfolded and refolded many times. Servants noticed these details, even when they pretended not to. Instructions regarding such letters were delivered quietly. Sometimes they came with the message itself, burn this after reading. Other times, the expectation was unspoken but absolute. A servant handed the letter over, waited nearby without appearing to wait, and then received it back folded differently, the decision already made. The kitchen hearth became a place of quiet erasure. Flames there were practical, not ceremonial. Paper disappeared quickly, curling into ash without spectacle. Servants burned letters carefully, watching until no fragment remained legible. Ashes were scattered or mixed with others, ensuring nothing could be retrieved. The act was performed calmly, routinely, as though destroying words were no more remarkable than peeling vegetables. These letters spoke of things the household could not afford to acknowledge. Affairs conducted discreetly, debts concealed, promises regretted, threats phrased politely. Servants did not read them fully, not always, but they learned enough from tone, from urgency, from repetition. The same hand writing again and again, the same request resurfacing with altered language. Morning was the preferred time for destruction. Before breakfast, before the household fully gathered itself, before routine allowed memory to settle. Servants ensured the letter's absence went unnoticed. Trays were cleared, surfaces wiped. The day resumed as if nothing had intruded. Occasionally, letters arrived too late. A servant might find one abandoned in a room after an argument, its presence dangerous. In these moments, judgment was required. To leave it risked discovery. To remove it risked blame. Servants weighed these choices quickly, guided by experience rather than instruction. Survival sharpened decision-making. Some letters were hidden rather than burned, kept temporarily, folded into drawers or slipped behind ledgers until the moment for destruction felt safer. These letters weighed heavily. Servants carried the knowledge of them like a held breath, aware that discovery would not end well. When they were finally burned, relief came quietly, mixed with unease. Not all letters were destroyed at the household's request. Some servants took initiative when they sensed danger, a note meant to be read by the wrong eyes, a message that arrived unexpectedly. These interventions were rare and risky, They were acts of protection without permission, justified only by instinct and consequence. Letters also served as evidence of absence, a correspondence that suddenly stopped, a promised reply that never came. Servants noticed these silences too. They understood that what was not written could be as telling as what was destroyed. Among servants, letters were spoken of indirectly. Another one for the fire. It's finished now. Language softened reality. No one lingered on details. Memory was enough. The household depended on this quiet censorship. Its reputation rested not only on what was done, but on what never survived to be proven. Servants were the gatekeepers of this fragile boundary, erasing words before they could take root in daylight. By the time breakfast was served, the hearth was clean, ashes cold. No trace remained of ink that might have altered lives. The household moved forward, intact, and servants continued their work, having already decided which truths would not be allowed to live past dawn. The arrival of clergy altered the atmosphere of the house in ways servants recognized immediately. Voices softened, movements slowed, expressions arranged themselves into reverence, chairs were placed with care. Servants prepared the space as though holiness itself required staging. Respectability gathered around the visitor like a garment worn deliberately. Clergy were received as moral authorities, yet servants understood the performance beneath the ceremony. These visits were rarely spontaneous. They followed moments of strain, grief, or scandal. A sermon offered privately, a prayer spoken behind closed doors, a confession framed carefully to preserve appearances. The house did not seek judgment, it sought reassurance. Servants facilitated these encounters with practiced discretion. They ushered clergy through side passages when necessary, avoiding unnecessary witnesses. They prepared tea or brandy according to preference already known. Familiarity existed beneath formality, though it was never acknowledged openly. Some clergymen visited often enough to feel like part of the household's private machinery. Confessions occurred quietly, sometimes in studies, sometimes in bedrooms. Servants lingered just outside earshot, available but unobtrusive. They heard murmurs, pauses, shifts in tone. They recognized the cadence of absolution, the weight of selective honesty. Confession, they learned, was not about truth in full, it was about relief without consequence. Servants noted what was never confessed, the treatment of those below stairs, the exhaustion imposed without thought, the lives quietly altered by dismissal or rumor. These matters rarely entered spiritual consideration. Morality traveled upward, not down. Clergy offered counsel that reinforced hierarchy, patience, endurance, acceptance of one's station. Servants overheard these words often enough to understand their intended audience. When servants themselves were addressed directly by clergy, advice followed the same pattern. Work diligently, be grateful, trust in order. These sentiments required no effort from those offering them. Some servants believed deeply, clinging to faith as solace. They prayed quietly, away from observation, shaping belief into something personal rather than institutional. Others grew skeptical, having witnessed too many absolutions granted without change. Faith fractured differently below stairs, shaped by lived contradiction. Hypocrisy revealed itself most clearly in repetition. The same confession offered again months later, the same counsel given without effect, the same behavior continuing unchanged. Servants recognized these cycles, cataloging them without commentary. They learned that confession often functioned as permission rather than correction. Not all clergy were blind to this. Some noticed the strain beneath the household's calm. Some addressed servants with unexpected kindness. These moments stood out precisely because they were rare. Servants remembered them quietly, as exceptions rather than norms. Clergy also served as conduits of information. News passed through them, marriages arranged, illnesses concealed, reputations preserved. Servants heard fragments of this, enough to understand that moral authority intertwined deeply with social management. The church reinforced boundaries as much as it soothed consciences. After a clerical visit, the house often felt lighter, though nothing had changed materially. Relief replaced tension temporarily. Servants adjusted routines to match this shift, smoothing transitions, accommodating renewed calm. They understood that this peace was provisional, dependent on silence holding. Confessions concluded, prayers ended, clergy departed with courteous farewells. The household resumed its practiced rhythm, absolved without accountability. Servants returned to work, having facilitated moral maintenance without being included in its benefits. In this way, the house preserved its sense of righteousness while leaving its structure untouched. Servants observed this without bitterness so much as clarity. They learned that morality, like respectability, functioned selectively. It soothed those who possessed power and instructed those who did not. And so the clergy came and went, offering comfort wrapped in ritual. Confessions were heard. Hypocrisy endured. Servants remained silent witnesses, carrying a faith shaped not by sermons, but by the quiet understanding that virtue in the household often meant nothing more than appearances maintained. Death entered the household quietly more often than not. It did not always arrive with ceremony or warning bells. Sometimes it came disguised as illness that lingered too long, as exhaustion mistaken for weakness, as a fall described later as unfortunate. Servants recognized these moments not by announcement, but by the sudden tightening of routine and the careful rearrangement of words. When death occurred upstairs, it was managed with dignity and distance. Doctors were summoned, curtains drawn, voices lowered into reverent tones. Servants moved quickly, instinctively, preparing rooms for visitors who would arrive already knowing what to say. Grief was structured, mourning followed rules. The household presented itself as solemn, composed, respectable, yet servants noticed how often the explanation arrived before the understanding. A cause provided neatly, a story repeated consistently, details omitted without question. These deaths were not examined so much as contained. The household did not seek answers, it sought closure. Deaths below stairs followed a different pattern. They were rarely afforded ceremony. A servant taken ill might be sent away quietly, their absence explained later as resignation. A body discovered after an accident was described carefully slipped, misjudged, careless. Language softened responsibility until it dissolved entirely. Servants understood the importance of these explanations. They protected the household from scrutiny. They prevented disruption. They ensured continuity. What mattered was not what had happened, but how it would be remembered or not remembered at all. Illness provided convenient cover. Tuberculosis, fever, weak lungs. These terms carried authority without inviting investigation. Servants accepted them outwardly, even as they recalled long hours, poor sleep, constant strain, cause and effect blurred deliberately. Accidents served a similar function. A fall downstairs, a burn from the hearth, a misstep in darkness. These explanations ended inquiry before it began. Servants learned to repeat them precisely, knowing inconsistency invited attention. There were moments when servants suspected more, bruises that did not align with stories, fear preceding disappearance, sudden removals framed as medical necessity. These suspicions remained internal. To voice them would change nothing except one's own position. Funerals, when they occurred, differed sharply by rank. A master's death halted the household. Servants wore black. Work slowed. Respectability required pause. A servant's death, by contrast, altered little. Duties were reassigned, rooms cleared, life continued without interruption. Servants felt these absences deeply. They had lived beside one another in proximity and exhaustion. Bonds formed quickly under such conditions. Loss arrived without acknowledgement. leaving grief unrecognized. Servants mourned quietly, privately, often alone. The house itself absorbed death without reaction. Rooms were cleaned thoroughly, bedding replaced, furniture rearranged. Physical traces disappeared swiftly, as though the space resisted memory. Servants participated in this erasure, knowing it was expected, knowing it hurt. Occasionally, a death troubled the household enough to require reinforcement of the explanation. Stories repeated carefully to guests. Questions deflected politely. Servants coached subtly on what to say and what to forget. Collective memory was managed deliberately. Over time, servants learned that death was not only an ending but an administrative task. It required coordination, discretion, and control. Emotion was secondary. Appearance remained paramount. These deaths did not linger in public record. They left no portraits, no written accounts. They survived only in the memories of those who had worked beside the deceased, shared meals, exchanged glances in passing. Memories carried without outlet, fading unevenly. In this way, death became another element of household maintenance. It was explained, contained, and smoothed into narrative that protected order. Servants bore witness to these disappearances, understanding that in the Victorian house, not every death was meant to be known, only accounted for, quietly, and then forgotten. To witness without being acknowledged was the servants' quiet inheritance. They stood at thresholds, moved through rooms, passed between conversations, present enough to observe, absent enough to be ignored. This position shaped their understanding of the household more deeply than any role or rank could. They saw not in moments, but in patterns. Witnessing was not a single act. It accumulated. A glance caught and dismissed. A remark overheard and filed away. A gesture repeated often enough to reveal habit. Servants learned to assemble meaning from repetition rather than confession. Truth arrived gradually, without declaration, formed by what happened again and again. They witnessed joy that was brief and carefully contained, laughter that stopped when a door opened, affection that softened into formality once others entered the room. They saw how happiness required management, how it could not be allowed to appear excessive or uncontrolled. Even pleasure obeyed rules. They witnessed cruelty that wore politeness as camouflage, a remark delivered lightly that landed heavily, a punishment framed as instruction, a dismissal justified as necessity. Servants recognized these acts not by their language, but by their effect, the way a room quieted afterward, the way posture changed, the way work continued with a sharper edge. They witnessed contradictions without naming them, a household that spoke of charity while exploiting labor, a family that prized honesty while arranging silence, a morality that flexed easily around convenience. Servants did not confront these inconsistencies directly. Confrontation required authority. Witnessing required endurance. Witnessing also extended downward. Servants observed one another closely, noting strain, illness, desperation. They learned who needed assistance before it was requested, who could be relied upon, who was nearing collapse. This attentiveness functioned as an informal safety net, thin but vital. There were moments when witnessing felt unbearable, when knowledge pressed heavily without outlet, when servants carried secrets that altered how they saw themselves and others. These moments were managed quietly through distraction, through routine, through the deliberate narrowing of attention. Survival depended on compartmentalization. Occasionally, witnessing crossed into intervention, a warning delivered quietly, a task delayed to prevent escalation, a door opened at the right moment. These actions were subtle and risky, undertaken without recognition or reward. They represented the limit of what witnessing could become without turning into defiance. The household relied on this role without ever acknowledging it. Order depended on servants who noticed problems before they surfaced publicly, who adjusted routines to accommodate mood, who absorbed tension and redistributed it through labor. Witnessing sustained stability invisibly. Servants also witnessed time itself. They saw children grow into adults, relationships shift, fortunes change. They marked these transitions not by ceremony but by detail, the way a voice deepened, the way footsteps slowed, the way rooms were repurposed. History unfolded around them without record. When servants left a household, they carried this witness with them. It did not translate easily elsewhere. Stories could not be shared. Details lost context. What remained was impression rather than narrative, a sense of how things truly functioned beneath surface order. This accumulation of witness shaped servants' inner lives profoundly. They became cautious, perceptive, reserved. They learned to read spaces and silences. They understood that reality often contradicted its presentation, and that acknowledgement of this contradiction carried cost. In being witnesses, servants occupied a paradoxical position. They were closest to truth and farthest from power. They knew what others pretended not to know. They saw what could not be spoken. And so they continued moving quietly, observing steadily, carrying knowledge without recognition. The house relied on their witness even as it denied their voice, ensuring that the truth remained present, contained, and ultimately unseen. Knowledge gathered below stairs did not behave like knowledge above. It did not grant authority, protection, or advancement. It offered no leverage unless used carefully, and even then, it cut both ways. Servants learned this early. To know was not to control. To see was not to decide. Knowledge, in their hands, was weight without handle. Servants knew which doors were opened reluctantly and which too eagerly. They knew which rooms were avoided and which cleaned obsessively. They recognized the difference between illness and indulgence, between grief and inconvenience, between affection and habit. This knowledge accumulated quietly, shaping how they moved through the house and through their own lives. Yet this understanding existed in isolation. It could not be shared freely. Knowledge spoken aloud transformed into accusation. Accusation invited retaliation. Silence remained safer. Servants learned to treat what they knew as something fragile, valuable, only insofar as it was hidden. This imbalance shaped behavior. Servants anticipated moods before they surfaced, adjusting routines accordingly. They altered timing, softened interactions, avoided triggers invisible to others. These adjustments prevented conflict, smoothed tension, preserved the household's outward calm. They were acts of skill without recognition. Power flowed in the opposite direction. Decisions were made without consultation. Explanations were offered only when convenient. Servants absorbed consequences without input. Knowledge did not reverse this flow. It merely sharpened awareness of it. There were moments when knowledge tempted action, a secret known by too many, a pattern too dangerous to ignore. In these moments, servants weighed risk instinctively. Would speaking protect or expose? Would silence preserve or endanger? These calculations occurred quickly, guided by experience rather than principle. Survival remained the measure. Occasionally, knowledge became currency, a hint offered carefully, a truth implied without being stated. These maneuvers were rare and dangerous, employed only when necessary. The line between protection and accusation was thin. Many chose never to approach it. This imbalance affected how servants understood justice. Fairness appeared abstract, detached from outcome. Right and wrong mattered less than consequence. Servants adjusted their moral expectations accordingly, focusing on what could be endured rather than what should change. Knowledge also shaped self-perception. Servants learned to see themselves as containers rather than participants. They held information without agency, awareness without influence. This condition altered how they related to the world beyond the house. They carried caution into every interaction, aware that knowing too much could be a liability anywhere. The household depended on this restraint. Its stability relied on servants who knew enough to prevent disruption, but not enough or not empowered enough to challenge structure. Knowledge without power became a tool of maintenance rather than transformation. Servants understood this paradox deeply. They lived inside it daily. They accepted it not because it was just, but because resistance carried cost. Adaptation ensured continuity. Over time, this dynamic shaped memory. Servants remembered selectively, allowing details to fade that served no purpose. Knowledge that could not be used lost sharpness. What remained was intuition, an understanding of how systems behaved, how people protected themselves, how appearances were preserved. When servants left service, they carried this understanding into the wider world. It did not translate easily. Others mistook their caution for ignorance, their silence for lack of insight. Servants rarely corrected this assumption. They had learned the value of being underestimated. Knowledge without power defined their position. It sharpened perception while limiting action. It taught restraint, patience, and endurance. It shaped a way of seeing that acknowledged truth without expecting it to prevail. And so servants continued, holding knowledge quietly, using it not to change the house, but to survive within it, aware that understanding did not equal authority, and that wisdom, when stripped of power, became something carried inward rather than expressed aloud. Below stairs, space was always shared, borrowed, temporary. The household claimed every square foot with expectation and authority. Hallways, kitchens, storage rooms, they were the veins through which labor moved, visible only when the body was needed. Privacy was rare, almost mythical. Yet, in some households, a single room offered servants a sliver of autonomy, a chamber that, for fleeting hours, belonged entirely to them. These rooms were modest, a narrow bed, sometimes shared with another, a chair or two, a table cluttered with personal items carefully hidden from oversight, a worn book, a small mirror, a keepsake, letters folded and tucked away. The space was functional, yes, but it carried significance far beyond mere furniture. It was a sanctuary of self, in a world that demanded invisibility. Servants arrived there after their duties, stepping across thresholds that symbolized a shift. Above stairs, etiquette dictated posture, speech, and attention. Below, they could relax shoulders, exhale breaths held in restraint, or simply sit still without immediate scrutiny. Even these moments were measured, but the measurement belonged to them. The room reflected the occupant's identity quietly. A particular pattern of tidiness, a small piece of fabric pinned to a wall, the way clothes were folded or piled. These were signals visible only to those who lived there, invisible to the household that demanded conformity. Within this space, a servant could shape surroundings to reflect something of themselves rather than the expectations of another. Privacy, however, was fragile. Sounds traveled easily. Doors did not always close fully. Housekeepers and matrons made rounds. Even when unobserved, the knowledge of surveillance shaped behavior. Servants learned to inhabit their own rooms with care, balancing comfort against the risk of exposure. A misplaced item or an unusual noise could attract attention, altering the delicate peace they had claimed. Within these walls, servants maintained connections to a world beyond labor. Letters, often received covertly, were read and folded again. Memories of family, friendships, or lost homes were rehearsed quietly. Small acts of self-expression, stitching, writing, sketching, created a sense of continuity in lives otherwise dictated by duty. Time passed differently here, marked by presence rather than orders. These rooms also served as refuges from hierarchy. Disputes, reprimands, and duties from above stairs held less power within these walls. A servant could speak freely to a trusted colleague who shared the space, discuss tasks without fear of immediate repercussion, or simply remain silent in a manner no one could interpret as defiance. The room became a stage where the servant controlled the script. Yet solitude brought its own weight. The room amplified awareness of what was absent: recognition, agency, freedom. Servants confronted fatigue, longing, and frustration with no audience, no consolation. Emotional labor did not pause because the door closed. Instead, it became concentrated, absorbed, and endured alone. Some rooms were shared, complicating the intimacy of solitude. Two maids, footmen, or cooks might inhabit the same chamber. They learned compromise, negotiation, and unspoken agreements. Privacy became layered. A shared space could still carry moments reserved for oneself, hidden in corners, under bed linens, within pockets. Morning reclaimed the room. Tasks resumed. Doors opened. Labor recommenced. The brief ownership vanished, leaving only memory of autonomy until night returned. Servants stepped back into service, carrying with them the weight and relief of a space where their lives were, for once, their own. And so the only room that belonged to them became more than shelter. It was a fragment of identity, a refuge of quiet endurance, a testament to survival in a household that demanded invisibility. Within its walls, servants remembered themselves, if only for a few hours, before returning once more to a world that never stopped observing. Friendship below stairs was forged not in leisure or choice, but in shared labor and unspoken understanding. Exhaustion bound servants together more tightly than ceremony or affection ever could. When the day pressed long, when limbs ached and sleep remained distant, bonds were created in the brief spaces between duty, moments of breath stolen, glances exchanged, hands meeting briefly in passing. These connections were subtle. A tray passed with a nod rather than instruction. A broom steadied for an overextended arm. A whispered warning about an approaching matron. These acts, small to the household above, carried profound weight for those who lived constantly in motion. Each gesture reinforced trust, demonstrated reliability, and acknowledged presence in a world that denied recognition. Exhaustion became a language. Shared fatigue spoke of limits, endurance, and experience. When one servant faltered, another adjusted silently, compensating without comment. A footman might carry an extra load. A maid delay folding linens by a single step. These mutual accommodations passed almost imperceptibly, but they were essential for maintaining rhythm and survival. Friendships formed in this way were tempered by discretion. Trust was valuable because misplacement of knowledge could destroy livelihoods. Servants confided sparingly, choosing moments when authority was elsewhere, voices were muffled, and attention diverted. Secrets were not merely shared, they were curated, exchanged with awareness of risk and consequence. Laughter, too, found its place within these bonds. Quiet, brief, often unrecognized, it offered reprieve from relentless expectation. A joke shared in the scullery, a smothered giggle while folding sheets, a fleeting smile across a corridor. Such moments carried an intimacy the household could never sanction, a reminder that beneath uniform, apron, and duty, servants remained human. Shared hardship shaped hierarchy within these friendships. Senior servants guided the junior through the demands of service, correcting missteps with care rather than criticism. Mentorship extended beyond labor: how to move, how to speak quietly, how to anticipate needs. The household recognized experience but rarely rewarded mentorship. Friendship carried the reward, informal, yet vital. Conflicts were inevitable but muted. Exhaustion dulled patience, yet bonds encouraged restraint. Arguments erupted briefly over shared responsibilities or perceived slights, but ended quickly under the pressure of necessity. Servants relied on one another not just for help, but for stability. The household could survive without camaraderie, but servants could not. Friendship also provided a conduit for information. Observations, warnings, or instructions passed between trusted pairs, allowing preparation for the day's challenges. These exchanges were never formalized. They existed as gesture, glance, or brief whisper, Knowledge, when shared in this manner, enhanced endurance without inviting scrutiny. Some friendships lasted years, persisting across houses and masters. Others dissolved when individuals were reassigned, dismissed, or otherwise removed. Each carried lessons, shaping how new bonds were formed. The memory of trust, however fleeting, guided behavior in subsequent service. In moments of extreme fatigue, when the household demanded more than the body could give, these friendships became essential. They sustained morale, created emotional anchors, and allowed brief reprieves, a shared understanding that no one else would comprehend. Neither family nor visitor provided a small but vital buffer against relentless expectation. And so, below stairs, companionship was less about sentiment than survival. Bonds formed in exhaustion carried weight because they sustained life within the household's demanding confines. In these quiet alliances, servants discovered the rarest of privileges: acknowledgement without observation, support without reward, and connection in a world that insisted on invisibility. Romance below stairs existed quietly, often unnoticed except by those who shared it. It was not the grand passion celebrated in novels or whispered in parlors upstairs. It was measured, discreet, and constrained, played out in stairwells, behind closed doors, in moments stolen between tasks. Servants knew the household would not condone such attachments, yet affection found its way into the spaces no one controlled. These relationships were born of proximity, days spent moving through the same corridors, performing parallel duties, observing shared rhythms fostered familiarity, hands brushed while passing trays. Glances lingered too long in the scullery or pantry. The briefest gestures became laden with meaning, subtle signals that could pass unnoticed by those above stairs, but charged with significance for the participants. Courts of romance operated with tacit rules. Public displays were forbidden. Words were whispered under the din of labor. Meetings were arranged around the household's schedule, never conflicting with the master's eye or the matron's inspection. Even the simplest touch carried risk. A hand held too long might invite suspicion. Secrecy shaped every interaction. Servants discovered ingenuity in concealment. Notes slipped into folds of linen. Messages hidden under chairs or behind pantry jars. A small token left with care and retrieved later. These artifacts of affection were ephemeral, meaningful only to those who shared them, but essential for sustaining connection. Each exchange strengthened trust while preserving invisibility. The limitations of space intensified the stakes. Shared rooms offered both opportunity and peril. One occupant could overhear, observe, or misinterpret, transforming intimacy into scandal. Trust was carefully measured. Silence became as important as speech, and discretion as vital as courage. Romance also offered reprieve from exhaustion. Labor demanded physical and mental endurance, and the household above stairs demanded perfection and submission. Brief moments of connection provided relief, a reminder that life existed beyond duty. Even a stolen glance or whispered word could restore energy, foster hope, and maintain morale. Pregnancy complicated these attachments, intensifying secrecy. Servants navigated the precarious balance of protection and concealment. A child born without acknowledgement risked dismissal, disgrace, or removal from the household. Lovers acted swiftly, quietly, and strategically to manage such situations, often relying on shared networks of other servants for support and concealment. Emotional labor accompanied physical labor. Servants modulated feelings, learning to suppress frustration, longing, and fear in public while expressing them privately. Affection was practiced discreetly, performed with awareness of consequence, and cherished in silence. The household's demands extended into matters of the heart, shaping intimacy into careful negotiation rather than free expression. Friendship often intertwined with romance. Allies below stairs provided counsel, intervention, or distraction when risk loomed. They carried messages, misdirected attention, or shielded gestures from detection. Solidarity became a necessary foundation upon which affection could flourish safely. Even brief encounters left lasting impressions. A shared meal, a touch in passing, a word spoken softly, these moments were catalogued in memory, treasured in isolation, and recalled later when labor or exhaustion threatened morale. They were reminders that life could persist despite surveillance, hierarchy, and obligation. In the margins, love was a quiet rebellion. It defied the rigid expectations imposed from above, affirming humanity in the spaces defined by labor. Servants learned that intimacy required patience, subtlety, and courage, and though rarely acknowledged, these connections offered a life otherwise denied, a private world of warmth, trust, and fleeting tenderness hidden beneath the stairs. Intimacy below stairs existed in shadows, as necessary as labor and as dangerous as fire left unattended. It was never sanctioned, never planned, never safe. Yet it persisted, driven by proximity, exhaustion, and desire for connection. Servants learned to navigate it as they did every other peril of the household, quietly, cautiously, and with attention to consequence. Encounters were brief and coded. Touches lingered in hallways, exchanged glances in stairwells, hands brushing along linen carts. Doors closed for moments too fleeting to be observed. Words were whispered, rarely carried beyond immediate ears. The household above would have considered such acts scandalous. For servants, discretion was survival. Safety, in the sense of health, was largely absent. Knowledge of disease, conception, and hygiene existed in fragments, often misunderstood or incomplete. Condoms were rare, knowledge of prevention scarce. Pregnancies were concealed, sometimes to dangerous lengths. Servants relied on secrecy as protection, not medicine. One misstep could ruin a life, terminate employment, or expose both participants to censure and loss. Despite risk, the need for physical connection remained. Long days of labor, exhaustion, and suppression created desire that could not be ignored. Affection, when possible, became entwined with survival strategies, companionship, warmth, and reassurance in a world that demanded invisibility. Physicality, however risky, was a rare assertion of autonomy in a life otherwise constrained. Couples learned the geography of the house intimately. Hidden corners, unused rooms, or lofted spaces provided brief sanctuary. Even the familiar corridors of labor could be navigated cautiously, exploiting timing and sound to allow gestures unseen. Trust was essential. Misjudgment could expose both parties, leading to dismissal or scandal. Pregnancy complicated these encounters further. Servants understood the consequences immediately. A single child could destroy employment. It could invite censure, shame, and displacement. Strategies emerged, hiding symptoms, claiming illness, or sending expectant women to relatives, yet even these measures were fraught with danger. The household's concern for reputation outweighed personal welfare. Illness followed naturally from lack of safety. Physical exhaustion, repeated exposure, and poor nutrition compounded risks. Infection, fever, and complications were treated privately or ignored until necessity demanded attention. Medicine, often controlled by the household or its appointed practitioners, offered partial remedy. Servants endured with quiet resignation, knowledge of risk tempered by absence of choice. Yet, within this danger existed care and negotiation. Partners developed unspoken rules, boundaries were respected silently, timing, gestures, and positioning were carefully calculated. Each encounter was a delicate balance of desire and prudence, intimacy and concealment. Even error was measured, corrected swiftly, silently, and without record. Friendships supported these acts indirectly. Allies could distract, delay rounds, or cover lapses in observation. Networks of mutual protection formed, reinforcing the unspoken agreement that intimacy required cooperation without discovery. Trust extended beyond affection, it became a practical necessity. Despite all precautions, consequences remained. Mistakes left traces, absences noted, whispers circulated, discipline followed swiftly. Servants carried both the physical and emotional burden, learning endurance and discretion simultaneously. In this way, sex below stairs became another facet of survival. It was desire restrained by circumstance, pleasure moderated by risk, intimacy mediated by secrecy. It offered humanity in a life designed for invisibility, reminding servants of what they could claim as their own, even when the household claimed everything else. In these fleeting moments, they asserted agency quietly, defying control while ensuring that the household above remained unaware. Pregnancy below stairs was a secret life carried in the body as much as in the mind. It arrived quietly, often unnoticed at first, revealing itself only through subtle changes that trained eyes and instincts could detect. A hand that lingered longer on the belly, a step slowed imperceptibly, a sudden pause during laborious tasks. These signs spoke volumes to those who observed carefully. Yet outwardly, the woman remained composed, obedient, and invisible, as if the body itself had learned discretion alongside the mind. The household above rarely acknowledged these pregnancies. For the family, appearances mattered more than reality. A child conceived in secret threatened hierarchy, decorum, and the illusion of control. Servants understood this fully, and they adapted. The pregnant woman continued her duties as far as she could, her movements measured, her expressions controlled. Support was offered quietly by allies below stairs, but public recognition was forbidden. The very act of existence became a performance. Timing was critical. Midwives or trusted senior servants monitored the progression discreetly. The slightest complication could be devastating, yet discussion was muted. Advice was conveyed in whispers, often through gestures or brief instructions, so that knowledge remained contained. There was never time for reflection, only survival. The woman learned to interpret signs from her own body and from those around her with precision, relying on intuition honed by secrecy. Nutrition and rest were precarious. Meals were controlled by household schedules, portions insufficient for two, or dictated by tasks that could not be delayed. Sleep remained fragmented, interrupted by rounds or duties. Servants adjusted for one another, sharing small comforts, covering tasks that might strain the pregnant body, subtly negotiating labor while maintaining discretion. Every gesture of assistance was itself a balancing act between care and concealment. Pregnancy amplified every other danger that existed below stairs. Illness could be ignored only for so long. Injuries might go untreated, either out of necessity or fear of discovery. Even simple fatigue carried more risk. The household demanded performance above all, and the pregnant woman was expected to comply, appearing unaffected by the changes that reshaped her body. Decisions about birth were fraught. Many pregnancies ended with the child being sent away immediately, placed with a relative, or in the care of a distant family of trust. Sometimes children were removed quietly, their absence explained as illness or adoption. Rarely were they allowed to remain in the house without scrutiny. The mother learned early to anticipate outcomes, to prepare mentally for separation even before the infant was born. Emotionally, the experience was isolating. The woman carried both life and secrecy simultaneously. Fear, longing, and attachment had no sanctioned outlet. Other servants provided a network of understanding, offering quiet support and small acts of solidarity. Yet the pressure to remain unseen and unaffected was constant. Every conversation, every gesture was filtered through the lens of discretion. Pregnancy below stairs was a microcosm of the household itself, full of life, burdened by obligation, constrained by hierarchy, and defined by invisibility. It demanded endurance, careful strategy, and tacit alliances. The woman learned to exist within these constraints, claiming the smallest fragments of agency where she could, while ensuring that the household above remained unaware of the profound events unfolding in the shadows. And so, life grew quietly within the house, concealed beneath starch, labor, and obedience, a reminder that even in the most restricted spaces, the body could assert its presence, demanding recognition in ways the household could neither fully control nor acknowledge. Alcohol flowed quietly through the lives of servants, not as indulgence, but as a fragile reprieve. A sip of ale or a spoonful of spirits provided warmth to exhausted limbs, a momentary easing of tension, a brief reprieve from the relentless cadence of labor. It was not sanctioned, yet it was understood. The household required its workers to endure, and endurance often demanded small concessions that could not be named. The hours after dusk were the most vulnerable. Tasks completed, the house quiet above, servants stole time in shadowed corners or hidden pantries. A tankard passed between hands, shared silently, with nods rather than conversation. The act was ritualized, measured, deliberate. Consumption, too early or too visibly, invited censure. Drinking had to be clandestine, timed precisely between observation and privacy. Alcohol was more than escape. It was signal. It marked boundaries of trust, moments of mutual understanding among those who shared the burden of labor. A footman offering a dram to a scullery maid was not merely sharing drink, but affirming connection, endurance, and survival. These exchanges carried meaning that the household above would never perceive. The effects were subtle at first. Fingers relaxed around utensils, posture softened, shoulders dropped, the tension accumulated through hours of suppression. Faces, usually composed, betrayed fleeting warmth. Laughter, stifled in public, surfaced briefly. These moments, though brief, reminded servants of life beyond duty, of feeling untethered from the omnipresent gaze of hierarchy. Yet drinking carried risk. A misjudged sip or poorly concealed bottle could attract attention. Too much loosened speech, revealing knowledge that must remain secret. Too little failed to achieve relief, leaving exhaustion unmitigated. Servants learned moderation instinctively, balancing necessity against consequence, autonomy against exposure. Alcohol also became a social tool. It eased negotiation among peers, lubricated alliances forged under fatigue. A shared drink settled arguments over chores, smoothed tempers, and reinforced loyalty. In a world where hierarchy constrained voice, these moments of communal indulgence allowed expression otherwise forbidden. Conversation could be freer, gestures less constrained, insight shared without formal acknowledgement. At times, the act of drinking reflected the household's own contradictions. Masters and mistresses consumed openly, enjoying company or soothing nerves, while servants' consumption remained hidden, clandestine, almost illicit. The disparity underscored the inversion of control. Those who labored longest required relief most urgently, yet their moments of solace were denied visibility and respect. Morning inevitably reclaimed these hours. Tankards were washed, bottles replaced, evidence removed. Any trace of indulgence erased to maintain the facade of propriety. The relief was ephemeral, its effects dissipated under the weight of new labor and resumed vigilance. Drinking existed as a temporary resistance to exhaustion, a quiet assertion of presence in a life structured to minimize agency. Servants carried these experiences in memory, observing their own limits and the limits of the household's tolerance. They learned the value of timing, of discretion, of sharing only with those who understood the stakes. Each moment of warmth, each fleeting laugh, each lifted tension became a small victory, a testament to resilience within confinement. And so, below stairs, drink was both necessity and ritual, survival and communion, solace and risk. It reminded servants that even in a world dominated by order, surveillance, and labor, small freedoms could be claimed quietly, carried with care, and surrendered without notice. In these moments, life bent briefly to their control, even as the house above remained rigidly composed and unseeing. Music below stairs was never performance. It was solace. Songs emerged quietly, hummed under breath, carried on the movement of hands at work or the rhythm of footsteps along worn floorboards. They were not meant for the drawing room, where harmony and propriety were prescribed. These melodies belonged to the hidden spaces, arising spontaneously, shaped by fatigue and imagination, by the longing to reclaim a fragment of self. Servants learned to sing softly, carefully, so that the household above could never discern the source. The scullery, the pantry, the back corridor, these were the stages where music lived. A broom's rhythm became accompaniment. A washboard's scrape added percussion. Even the creaking of stairs contributed to a private symphony. Every note was deliberate in its volume, every cadence mindful of ears not meant to hear. Songs carried memory and identity, old ballads from childhood, melodies learned from mothers or sisters, snippets of tunes overheard in the world beyond the house. These were repurposed to fill moments of exhaustion. Lyrics whispered sorrow, joy, hope, and longing, all hidden beneath the veil of labor. They were not rehearsed, not performed. They were breathed into being to sustain the spirit when the body demanded only work. Sometimes songs emerged spontaneously, shaped by circumstance. A sudden gust rattling window panes inspired rhythm. The aroma of food reminded a cook of summer festivals long past. A shared glance between servants, weighted with understanding, prompted a quiet duet. Music became communication, a way to express sentiment that could not be spoken, a bridge between isolation and solidarity. These melodies also carried caution. Too loud, and authority might notice. Too conspicuous, and curiosity could invite scrutiny. Servants modulated tone and pace instinctively, practicing discretion as rigorously as any chore. Every note was a negotiation between desire and necessity, between relief and concealment. Friendship and intimacy often intertwined with these songs. A familiar melody passed from one pair of hands to another, from one voice to another, creating shared memory and quiet connection. Humming together for a moment, they acknowledged presence and endurance without violating the hierarchy above. Music became a secret code, a subtle act of defiance, and a rare pleasure within constraint. Some songs mourned absence, loss, or longing. Others celebrated small victories, tasks completed, obstacles overcome, moments of respite survived. Servants carried these tunes in their memory, repeating them internally when labor became overwhelming, when exhaustion threatened morale. Music became both companion and shield, sustaining energy and composure without revealing vulnerability. The house absorbed these sounds without understanding. Floors carried them in echoes, walls diffused them into harmless resonance. Above stairs, nothing registered. The family might have imagined silence or imagined focus, but the hidden melodies flowed uninterrupted, offering comfort where it could be afforded. By dawn, songs subsided, voices were lowered, humming gave way to the measured cadence of duty. Yet their memory lingered, embedded in muscle memory, in rhythm of movement, in the steady pulse of hands that had labored through the night. Music below stairs survived invisibly, ephemeral yet enduring, shaping resilience in a world defined by observation, restraint, and obligation. And so, songs, not meant for the drawing room, persisted as a quiet rebellion, a testament to spirit, a marker of self, and a secret joy carried invisibly through the life of the house. In melody, servants found fleeting freedom, even as labor reclaimed them, and the household remained undisturbed and impeccably ordered. Defiance below stairs was never grandiose. It did not declare itself in protest or demand recognition. It existed in the margins, subtle and deliberate, enacted with precision so as not to invite notice. A tray set slightly askew, a broom left resting longer than prescribed, a whisper delayed, These were the gestures through which servants asserted autonomy in a world that demanded invisibility. Every act of defiance was measured against consequence. Too bold, and reprimand followed swiftly, sometimes punishment that could end employment. Too timid, and the act lost its effect entirely. Servants became masters of calibration, learning over years how to balance resistance against survival. Defiance was most potent when it went unnoticed, its meaning understood only by those who shared the household's rhythms and restrictions. These acts were often practical as much as symbolic. A missing ingredient replaced creatively, laundry folded with care yet arranged to signal subtle protest, tasks completed with a marginal deviation from expectation, enough to assert choice without inviting scrutiny. Each deviation required planning, observation, and timing. It was labor as negotiation, performed invisibly, rewarded silently. Small acts of defiance also fostered solidarity. When one servant noticed the injustice imposed on another, a glance or slight adjustment could shift the burden. Subtle interventions were commonplace, delaying a bell's answer to allow a colleague to rest, misdirecting attention away from a minor error, or taking on an extra chore to cover another's lapse. These were quiet rebellions, performed collaboratively yet discreetly, sustaining mutual survival. Rebellion could also be expressive, though never dramatically. A smudge left deliberately on a polished surface, a letter misfiled in a way that avoided immediate detection, a song hummed in code, signaling dissent or amusement. These gestures were ephemeral yet potent, communicating resistance without confrontation. They reminded servants that their presence was not entirely owned by the household, that identity persisted beneath uniform, apron, and assigned duties. Even appearance could serve defiance. A slightly loosened collar, a shoe softened for comfort, a hair ribbon arranged subtly against expectation, these small adjustments asserted bodily autonomy. They were intimate, private, and fleeting. Recognition, if it occurred, was often accidental, yet the act itself affirmed agency. The household, unaware, relied on these gestures more than it could imagine. A misaligned tray, a momentary delay, a quietly redirected task, these imperfections sustained the rhythm of labor when strict adherence might have created errors or collapse. Defiance, paradoxically, reinforced order by humanizing the work, introducing subtle flexibility into rigid structures. Yet, these acts carried constant risk. Discovery could provoke punishment, dismissal, or social censure. Servants learned to read moods, anticipate attention, and conceal intention. Timing and context were as vital as the act itself. Defiance required discretion as much as courage. Emotional relief accompanied these small gestures. Each successful act, unnoticed and unremarked upon, brought a fleeting sense of power. It affirmed that life below stairs was not entirely determined by expectation, that within restriction, choice persisted, that the body and mind retained capacity for subtle assertion. In this way, servants maintained a delicate balance, obedience above, autonomy below. Each minor rebellion became a testament to endurance, resilience, and creativity in constraint. These small acts of defiance did not alter the household's image or hierarchy, but they sustained the human spirit within it, ensuring that even in invisibility, servants remained present, aware, and quietly insistent on their own existence. Dreams below stairs were shaped by both longing and practicality. Servants rarely allowed themselves fantasies without careful containment. The house demanded attention, obedience, and labor, yet in the quiet spaces between tasks, imagination found a place. It crept along the narrow corridors, lingered in the scullery, and whispered softly in the dormitory at night. Dreams of leaving, of freedom, of a life unbound by hierarchy sustained many through years of invisibility. These dreams were never reckless. They were carefully constructed, measured against risk and feasibility. To imagine simply running away, abandoning employment, or confronting the household openly was folly. Servants learned early that escape required subtlety, planning, and patience. They visualized routes quietly, streets beyond the city, relatives who might provide refuge, opportunities for work elsewhere. These mental exercises were as much preparation as indulgence. Dreams offered solace, even when improbable. They created mental spaces where agency could be exercised. A maid envisioned herself walking along a sunlit street rather than scrubbing floors. A footman imagined a room of his own, free of scrutiny, where he could stretch without fear of reprimand. These moments, though fleeting, provided sustenance for the spirit, a reminder that life existed beyond the walls and rules that constrained daily labor. Friendships often fueled these dreams. Conversations whispered in corners, shared confidences, or small acts of solidarity encouraged belief that survival elsewhere was possible. The story of someone who had left successfully circulated quietly, offering proof that escape, while fraught, was achievable. These narratives were rarely shared with masters or matrons, yet they circulated widely among peers, shaping hope and strategy alike. Dreams were also anchored in observation. Servants noticed the lives of those above stairs, the freedom of movement, the ownership of space, the absence of constant surveillance. They contrasted this with their own constrained existence, cataloguing the inequities carefully. These mental inventories reinforced the longing for departure and often guided practical planning: which city to aim for, what employment might be sought, which contacts could assist. Yet dreams were bittersweet. They existed alongside knowledge of impossibility, family obligations, financial need, fear of punishment, and lack of resources constrained action. Servants recognized that to dream without control was to court despair. Therefore, fantasies were maintained in private, experienced internally, and shared only when trust allowed. Even then, they were couched in caution, disguised as casual speculation or musings about a distant town or imagined home. The nights were most conducive to these dreams. After labor ended, after the household above fell into rest, servants reclined in narrow beds or quiet corners, replaying visions of escape. Sleep sometimes blurred with dreaming, merging longing and strategy. Mental rehearsals of departure provided both comfort and clarity, allowing imagination to operate as rehearsal for the life they might yet claim. Occasionally, these dreams informed small acts of defiance, minor rebellions that allowed agency to manifest subtly. Delaying a task, misplacing an item, or bending a rule for one's own comfort became miniature enactments of the freedom imagined. These gestures were ephemeral but empowering, linking fantasy with action in a way the household could never perceive. In this way, dreams of leaving sustained servants through the repetition, fatigue, and invisibility of daily labor. They offered hope, patience, and the quiet assertion of self, reminding each worker that a life beyond the house, though hidden, deferred, and uncertain, remained conceivable, tangible within imagination, and precious as any reality withheld. Marriage below stairs existed in shadow and in quiet defiance of the household's strict hierarchy. It was neither publicized nor celebrated with fanfare. Instead, it was negotiated carefully, performed discreetly, and sustained through unspoken agreements that balanced desire with survival. Servants understood that union could bring solace, companionship, and shared resilience, but also risk, for visibility could invite reprisal from those who ruled above. Couples often met through proximity. A footman and a maid, assigned to the same corridor or routine, found moments to speak, to exchange glances, to support one another through long hours. Shared labor built familiarity, and familiarity often deepened into affection. These connections were tempered by caution, for the household demanded performance first and personal attachment second. To be discovered was to risk censure or dismissal. Courtship below stairs was subtle. Gifts were small, a ribbon left folded in a pocket, a note tucked into a linen bundle, a moment of shared warmth while performing tasks. Physical proximity was managed with discretion. Touches, gestures, and glances carried significance, but all were calibrated to remain invisible to the household's ever-present gaze. Public acknowledgement could undo months of careful labor and negotiation. Marriage required planning, both practical and covert. Couples considered timing, household routines, and the risks of discovery. They relied on allies among peers, fellow servants who could watch doors, distract supervisors, or provide counsel. Knowledge of schedules became essential. Every step, every conversation, measured to avoid attention. Survival depended as much on strategy as on affection. Pregnancy and children amplified stakes. Conception brought both hope and danger. The household above demanded discretion and continued labor, while partners navigated the uncertainty of their own futures. Children were often removed immediately, placed with distant relatives, or concealed within trusted networks. Parenthood had to be managed silently, balancing care with invisibility. Couples learned to anticipate and adapt, shaping lives within strict confines. Domestic space for married servants was minimal. Shared rooms were narrow, often divided only by modest screens or partitions. Privacy existed in slivers, moments when the household's gaze was elsewhere, doors closed or hallways empty. Within these constraints, couples constructed intimacy, marking time and space as their own, however briefly. These sanctuaries became essential for morale, offering reprieve from exhaustion and affirmation of human connection. Marriage also reshaped labor dynamics. Couples coordinated duties to support one another, covering for fatigue or illness, sharing burdens with subtle efficiency. Alliances were strengthened not just emotionally but practically. Timing, observation, and mutual reliance became tools of survival. Tasks that might have been isolating were shared, creating a rhythm that sustained both work and relationship. Yet these unions were never free of risk. Gossip circulated quietly. Mistakes could be attributed to personal distraction. Authority could intervene, reprimanding or separating partners. Even success required constant vigilance. Discretion was maintained not only for the couple's sake, but for the stability of the household. Marriage below stairs was thus both rebellion and endurance. It asserted autonomy in a life designed for invisibility. It claimed connection in spaces constrained by labor, hierarchy, and surveillance. It required negotiation, patience, and courage, and offered companionship, relief, and occasional joy. And so, in the hidden world beneath the stairs, servants married, servants creating pockets of intimacy and solidarity that existed parallel to the household's strict order, asserting the persistence of life, desire, and humanity in a space that demanded otherwise. Dismissal was the sharpest cut below stairs. It arrived suddenly, without ceremony, without warning, leaving both emptiness and questions in its wake. The household above rarely offered reasons. A servant found a task reassigned, a door locked, or a uniform removed from the wardrobe, and understood instinctively their service was no longer required. Explanation was a luxury granted only to those who held favor, and often, even then, it remained incomplete. The announcement of dismissal was typically brief, a housekeeper's sharp word, a matron's curt instruction. Sometimes it was a written note, folded and left where the servant would find it. No justification followed, no acknowledgement of years of labor, no recognition of sacrifices made. The act was final and absolute. One day, one moment, one motion, and the household redefined existence. Present, no longer. Servants learned early that this could happen at any time. The precariousness shaped behavior, cultivating obedience, caution, and restraint. They followed instructions meticulously, aware that a single misstep might be the cause of dismissal even if the reason remained unstated. Survival depended on precision and silence, and even excellence offered no immunity. The emotional impact was profound. Servants carried exhaustion, secrecy, and burden daily, yet dismissal introduced shock into the carefully measured rhythm of life. Anger, grief, fear, all were compressed into private spaces, managed internally, for public display was forbidden. Tears were swallowed. Thoughts of protest were silenced. To challenge the decision was to invite deeper consequences, possibly exposure, or even blacklisting from other households. Dismissal disrupted more than employment, it unsettled identity. Below stairs, labor defined existence. A servant's body, habits, and movements were honed to sustain the household's order. To be dismissed was to lose not only income but structure, purpose, and connection. Routine, once relentless, ended abruptly, leaving a void that was both physical and psychological. Preparation for departure, when possible, was rapid and secretive. Belongings were gathered quietly, trunks packed, personal effects concealed or retrieved from shared spaces. The act required composure under pressure. Any hesitation or visible distress risked scrutiny. Fellow servants sometimes assisted, offering guidance, distraction, or aid in concealing items. Solidarity, though limited, mitigated some of the suddenness. In some cases, dismissal followed suspicion rather than proof. A rumor, a minor mistake, or a perceived slight could suffice. Servants understood that reputation, once tarnished, could become as fatal as overt transgression. Networks of gossip and hierarchy ensured that news of dismissal traveled, warning others and reinforcing the invisible rules of obedience. The house itself offered no comfort. Floors remained polished, fires continued to burn, bells summoned labor as though nothing had changed. The world above stairs assumed continuity, unaffected by the sudden absence of one who had maintained its rhythm so tirelessly. The household's calm persisted, indifferent to the upheaval beneath. For the dismissed, departure was both relief and loss. Relief from relentless labor, from surveillance, from unceasing expectation. Loss of structure, identity, and the fragile community below stairs. The act of leaving was quiet, often unnoticed except by those who had labored alongside the departing servant. And so, dismissal without explanation became an ever-present shadow. It underscored the precariousness of life below stairs, the authority of the household above, and the vulnerability of those who served invisibly. It was a reminder that survival required vigilance, endurance, and discretion, for even excellence could not guarantee continuance in a world that demanded silence, obedience, and invisibility above all else. In the household, references carried weight heavier than any tray, broom, or folded sheet. They were the quiet instruments of judgment, wielded not by swords or scoldings, but by words carefully composed on paper or delivered verbally to other employers. A reference could preserve a career or destroy it, and servants learned quickly that these letters, so easily taken for granted, were weapons as sharp and unpredictable as any blade. Servants understood the system early. When leaving a household, one's future employment often depended on the goodwill or discretion of those above stairs. A favorable mention could open doors to better work, safer conditions, or even modest advancement. A negative word, delivered subtly, could spread silently through a network of employers, closing opportunities without overt explanation. The power of reference was absolute because it was largely invisible and because few questioned it. References were crafted with care, their tone measured with the precision of a surgeon. Praise might be restrained, leaving a faint suggestion of inadequacy. Criticism could be buried in politeness, hidden in phrasing that appeared neutral on the surface, but carried clear implication to those accustomed to reading between the lines. A single sentence could dictate the course of a servant's life. Servants became acutely aware of their vulnerability. Every misstep, every lapse, every forgotten chore could echo beyond the house in which it occurred. An error unnoticed at the moment might later appear in a reference, disguised as a matter-of-fact statement. Excellence, by contrast, was rarely rewarded beyond the assurance of continued employment. It could never fully shield one from the subtle judgments encoded in letters of recommendation. Friendships below stairs could influence these outcomes, subtly shaping impressions. Allies whispered advice: how to avoid notice, how to phrase departures politely, how to leave quietly with dignity intact. Even these interventions had limits. The ultimate authority rested in the hands of the household above, where a reference was prepared with intent, conscious of the servant's prospects. References also served as moral instruments. They could communicate character judgments without overt accusation. Reliability, discretion, obedience, these qualities were emphasized not only for merit but for control. The presence or absence of praise for initiative, intelligence, or kindness could delineate which traits were valued and which were to be suppressed. Servants internalized these lessons, understanding that their conduct shaped how they would be remembered long after leaving the house. The fear of negative references shaped behavior profoundly. Servants became hyper-aware of every action, every utterance, every glance. Discretion extended beyond obedience to include appearance, tone, and alignment with household expectations. Mistakes were minimized, emotions contained, and judgment deferred. Even private conversations required caution, for rumor could travel and be reported, transforming into a subtle critique in writing. Yet references were not always punitive. A thoughtful mention could provide protection, subtly signaling competence and reliability to prospective employers. Savvy servants cultivated goodwill carefully, performing not for recognition above stairs, but for the intangible record that would follow them beyond the house. In this way, a reference became a currency fragile, unpredictable, yet immensely valuable. When a servant finally departed, the act of leaving became entwined with this invisible battlefield. Every gesture, every word, every nod mattered. A misstep could taint reputation. Composure could preserve it. References were the household's final assessment, lingering after the body had moved on. They reminded servants that authority persisted even in absence, that judgment extended beyond sight and sound, and that survival required mastery not only of labor, but of perception itself. And so references, quiet and unseen, functioned as weapons wielded through words. They reinforced hierarchy, controlled opportunity, and reminded servants that their lives, though lived largely in shadow, were continually scrutinized. Knowledge of this power shaped every action, teaching vigilance, discretion, and the constant negotiation of existence in a world that demanded invisibility above all else. Blacklists were invisible, whispered, and feared. They existed in the networks connecting households, carried not by official documents but by memory, reputation, and rumor. One misstep, one perceived lapse, one poorly timed word could ripple outward, leaving a servant untrusted, unwelcome, and effectively erased from opportunity. These lists were not written in ink. They were inscribed in the collective knowledge of masters and housekeepers, silently enforced across town and country alike. Servants understood their fragility early. Every action, every expression, every whispered conversation carried weight. A mistake could follow them from house to house, muted by courtesy but sharpened by implication. Years of service, excellence, and endurance offered no immunity. A solitary error could render a lifetime of labor meaningless, leaving them without recourse. Survival depended on vigilance, discretion, and quiet conformity. The mechanics of blacklisting were subtle. A scolding delivered by a master or matron might be repeated in a letter of recommendation, or the absence of praise might signal a problem. Gossip traveled swiftly among social networks of employers, disguised as casual observation or polite counsel. "She is competent but somewhat difficult," or "He is reliable, though somewhat spirited." Phrases that appeared neutral could carry unmistakable warning for those trained to interpret them. Servants learned to read the unspoken rules as carefully as any written instruction. Which households were interconnected, which employers communicated regularly, which masters were especially influenced by particular housekeepers. Knowledge of these networks became essential for continued employment. To ignore it was to risk sudden dismissal, denial of reference, or subtle ostracism. Friendship and alliance provided limited protection. Peers below stairs offered counsel, warnings, or advice on conduct, helping navigate the invisible maps of influence. A whispered suggestion, a shared observation, could prevent a misstep from escalating into long-term consequences, yet even these safeguards were incomplete. Ultimately, the power rested with those above, whose words, gestures, and memories determined reputations. Being blacklisted was a precarious existence. Work became scarce, opportunities evaporated silently. Some servants were forced to relocate, seeking employment in distant towns or different regions, leaving behind communities and networks they had relied upon. Others were relegated to houses of lesser repute, enduring harsher conditions and diminished status. The consequences extended beyond the professional. Social and personal lives were constrained as well. Blacklists were also uneven in application. Certain infractions were punished more severely than others, depending on temperament, favoritism, or whim. A servant could perform identical duties in two households and be praised in one, condemned in another. This inconsistency reinforced caution, teaching that survival required adaptation to the expectations of each environment, rather than reliance on universal fairness. Servants learned to carry their history silently, aware that each interaction contributed to their perceived reliability. Reputation became as important as skill. They honed discretion, restraint, and attentiveness, recognizing that unseen eyes and remembered words could wield more power than any supervisor present. Every act of defiance, misjudgment, or misstep risked not only immediate censure but long-term exclusion. In this way, blacklists shaped life below stairs. They governed conduct, reinforced hierarchy, and underscored vulnerability. Servants moved carefully, measured gestures and words, and observed without comment. Their lives were bounded not only by duty, but by the invisible structures of reputation, enforced silently across households. Knowledge of this fragile balance was essential. To ignore it was to risk disappearance from employment, from community, and from the very networks that sustained their lives. And so, blacklists existed not as documents or laws, but as enduring shadows, silent reminders that labor, obedience, and discretion were never sufficient alone, and that survival required mastery of perception, timing, and the delicate negotiation of trust below stairs. For servants dismissed or blacklisted, the streets became the only refuge. The carefully ordered rhythm of the household, its bells, its routines, its invisible hierarchies, was replaced abruptly by uncertainty. The transition was neither immediate nor gentle. One day, the body moved within a defined space, performing familiar motions under strict expectation. The next, it wandered a city that paid little attention to skill, labor, or endurance. The world beyond stairs was merciless, indifferent, and unregulated. The first realization was practical: where to go, what to eat, whom to trust. Those dismissed without explanation carried possessions no larger than could be hidden on the person trunks left behind, belongings confiscated or reassigned, uniforms taken for future service elsewhere. A simple apron or jacket might mark identity publicly, and identity in these streets was perilous. Servants learned to conceal themselves, walking carefully to avoid recognition and potential gossip that could extend blacklists further. The streets were chaotic and dangerous. Work was unpredictable, wages meager, and the risk of injury or theft ever present. Servants accustomed to structured labor faced an unfamiliar and unstructured world. A misstep in timing could mean loss of opportunity. A misjudged interaction could invite violence. The precision honed below stairs timing, silence, observation became a tool for survival, repurposed in the open air. Networks offered some relief. Fellow servants, former colleagues, or sympathetic acquaintances sometimes provided shelter, temporary work, or information about employers in need of labor. These alliances were informal, fragile, and bound by mutual necessity rather than trust. Guidance was never guaranteed, and one misjudgment could destroy fragile support. Survival depended on careful observation and discretion, just as it had within the household. Exhaustion and exposure compounded danger. Days were long and irregular, nights were cold, streets damp, and food scarce. The body that had been trained to endure the rhythm of household labor now faced relentless uncertainty. Fatigue altered perception, slowed reactions, and increased vulnerability. The servant who had moved with precision through stairs and corridors now navigated unfamiliar alleys and markets, constantly calculating risk. The psychological weight was immense. Displacement erased identity. Former authority figures, accustomed to directing, now had no voice. Former peers, once collaborators, might be gone or unsympathetic. Social invisibility persisted, but without protection. Memory of the household's order became both comfort and torment, a reminder of a world where survival had been constrained but predictable. Yet the streets offered small freedoms. Movement was unconstrained. Voice could be exercised without immediate repercussion. Choices, though limited, were broader than those allowed below stairs. These moments were fleeting, fragile, and often illusory, but they allowed the individual to regain a sense of agency denied for years. Even in hardship, the mind grasped for opportunity. Adaptation became imperative. Servants learned to negotiate wages, claim space, and navigate social dynamics quickly. Observation, discretion, and judgment remained essential. Skills honed in kitchens, pantries, and corridors were redeployed in taverns, markets, and alleys. Those who survived did so through vigilance, patience, and strategic silence. And so, falling into the streets was not merely displacement, it was the continuation of survival in a harsher, unstructured world. The invisible hierarchies of the household persisted in memory, guiding movement, judgment, and caution. Servants who once moved seamlessly beneath stairs now carried their training into streets where freedom and danger coexisted, where invisibility remained both protection and peril, and where every step determined whether life would endure or falter. For some servants, falling into the streets ended not with employment elsewhere, but with the workhouse, the final, starkest refuge of Victorian society. Here, labor and survival converged under the most rigid and impersonal order, stripped of individuality, choice, and comfort. The workhouse was a place of last resort, a threshold where invisibility became enforced, and where every breath, step, and motion was measured against rules designed to maintain control rather than dignity. Arrival was immediate, disorienting, and unceremonious. The gates closed behind the weary, and the building's interior revealed its strict logic. Rows of beds, narrow corridors, and kitchens where the labor was constant, monitored, and communal. There were no private rooms, no corners to claim. Even the smallest possessions were catalogued and controlled. Freedom existed only as compliance, and individuality was tolerated in gestures so minor that it required careful observation to notice. Life in the workhouse followed an exacting rhythm. Bells summoned labor at prescribed hours. Meals were distributed and consumed under surveillance. Floors were swept, laundry folded, utensils polished. Beds prepared, tasks similar in appearance to household service, yet infinitely more constrained by the absence of choice. Each motion reinforced discipline. leaving no space for deviation or personal expression. Failure or delay invited reprimand, often in public, consolidating the hierarchy imposed upon those who had once been independent, however minimally. Social bonds persisted, but they were shaped by necessity rather than affection. Servants and laborers learned quickly to navigate alliances with care. Shared meals, whispered instructions, or subtle assistance provided brief relief from monotony and pressure. Trust was conditional, always measured against observation, as one misstep could lead to punishment, reassignment, or isolation. Even friendship required vigilance. The workhouse's structure enforced hierarchy and control more strictly than any household below stairs. The workhouse emphasized survival through compliance. Illness was tolerated only when unavoidable. Exhaustion was expected to be borne silently. Personal agency was limited to small decisions, the order of personal chores, the management of meager possessions, or the brief reprieve found in shared glances or whispered confidences. Every action was governed by the imperatives of the institution, and deviation was costly. Yet within these constraints, subtle acts of resilience persisted. Servants discovered ways to reclaim fragments of autonomy, performing tasks slightly faster to allow fleeting rest, exchanging minor kindnesses in ways unnoticed by overseers, or finding isolated corners to breathe in silence. These were acts of quiet defiance, akin to the gestures they had practiced below stairs, albeit within a far more constraining environment. Observation sharpened instinct. Servants who had survived households' invisible hierarchies applied the same skills to the workhouse, monitoring supervisors, anticipating expectations, and navigating communal spaces with caution. Knowledge became survival. Experience below stairs offered a framework for endurance, even in this harsher, less forgiving world. Life in the workhouse compressed time and labor into cycles that eroded individuality while demanding vigilance. Days blurred, nights offered little rest. Yet, for those accustomed to invisibility, these conditions were familiar, if intensified. Servants endured by transforming skill into instinct, discipline into adaptation, and silence into shield. And so, the workhouse became the final stage in a continuum of survival below stairs and beyond. It was both refuge and prison, a place where life was preserved but freedom denied. Here, servants confronted the extremes of structure, hierarchy, and endurance, learning once more that existence depended not on recognition or favor, but on mastery of motion, observation, and the quiet art of remaining unseen. Some women below stairs disappeared without ceremony, without warning, and often without explanation. They were the invisible casualties of a rigid system that demanded obedience, discretion, and invisibility above all else. A sudden absence might be whispered about among peers, speculated upon in quiet corners, but rarely acknowledged openly. The household above continued its routine as if nothing had changed, leaving gaps in memory that servants alone carried, heavy and unresolved. These vanishings took many forms. Some women were dismissed suddenly, their presence no longer required, their departures explained vaguely or not at all. Others succumbed to illness, overwork, or exhaustion, and were removed quietly, their fates softened in language or concealed entirely. Pregnancy, scandal, or indiscretion could precipitate disappearance, resolved swiftly to protect the household's appearance. Each absence reinforced the lesson. Survival depended upon remaining unnoticed. Servants learned to recognize the signs beforehand. A woman who faltered under pressure, who appeared too weary, too outspoken, or too observant, was vulnerable. Missteps that would have been overlooked elsewhere became intolerable under scrutiny. Alliances mattered, but even trusted networks offered limited protection. Social networks above stairs were strict and unforgiving. Disappearance followed swiftly and quietly, leaving peers to absorb the shock in silence. Memory became both witness and burden. Those who remained catalogued the vanished woman's routines, habits, and traces, recalling them in detail even as the household above erased all visible evidence. A misplaced shoe, a missing apron, the sudden reassignment of tasks all marked absence, but they could not explain it. Peers learned to carry these invisible stories, preserving knowledge without agency, observing without influence. Some women vanished into marriage, moved by arrangement or coercion, their labor redirected to distant households or private service. Others disappeared into workhouses, charity institutions, or boarding arrangements, traded like commodities to preserve order above stairs. In every instance, agency was limited, and decisions were imposed rather than chosen. Survival demanded compliance even in exit, obscuring autonomy beneath layers of enforced decorum. The psychological weight of disappearance was acute. Peers processed grief quietly, constrained by the need for continued labor and discretion. Expression of mourning was suppressed. Any outward sign risked attention, judgment, or implication. Silence became both protection and imprisonment, a way to survive while bearing witness to loss. Emotional labor extended beyond the body, encompassing memory, vigilance, and discretion simultaneously. Disappearance shaped the behavior of those who remained. Awareness of vulnerability intensified caution, reinforced hierarchy, and encouraged conformity. Peers observed carefully, anticipating scrutiny, modifying expression, and limiting initiative. Even small acts of independence were tempered by the fear that missteps could precipitate their own erasure. Knowledge of what could happen reinforced obedience, endurance, and discretion. Yet the vanished left traces, subtle and persistent. Objects misplaced or left behind, tasks reassigned, routines disrupted. These fragments reminded peers that absence was never absolute. Memory became the vessel of continuity, preserving both knowledge and warning. The women who disappeared continued to shape life below stairs, quietly, invisibly, through absence alone. In this way, women who vanished embodied the stakes of life beneath stairs. Obedience, discretion, and invisibility were not abstract ideals, but matters of survival. Their departures reinforced hierarchy, transmitted caution, and maintained the household's seamless appearance. Servants learned from absence as much as from instruction, carrying the lessons of disappearance forward in silence, endurance, and ever-watchful awareness. Below stairs, men who drank too much became cautionary figures, living reminders of the fragile boundary between endurance and collapse. Alcohol was both solace and peril. A sip could ease exhaustion, a draught could sustain long hours, but for some, the relief became habitual, and habit transformed into dependence. Men drank not only to warm their bodies after cold nights, but to numb minds fatigued by relentless labor, unacknowledged effort, and invisible oversight. The signs were subtle at first. A footman lingered too long over ale after completing his duties. A cook took small sips from bottles intended for preparation, prolonging the warmth in his chest. Hands shook slightly when tasks were delayed. Eyes glazed in moments of pause, hinting at a retreat into intoxication. Peers recognized these signs immediately. They knew that excess threatened not only the individual, but the fragile rhythm of labor, the cohesion of work, and the stability of shared spaces. Alcohol blurred responsibility. Tasks once performed with precision began to slip. Floors were swept less thoroughly, utensils cleaned unevenly, trays carried with a tremor. Mistakes invited reprimand, yet the cycle of drinking continued, driven by fatigue and the need to escape both pain and expectation. The household above remained largely unaware, assuming competence until visible error demanded explanation. Dependence carried social consequences. Other servants learned to work around the intoxicated, adjusting their pace, covering lapses, and minimizing risk. Friendships were strained, alliances tested. Compassion existed but was measured carefully. Enabling could imperil both the helper and the one who drank. Discipline remained subtle. Intervention was often indirect, through persuasion or rearrangement of tasks, rather than confrontation. Drinking also shaped perception of power. Men who drank frequently were less able to navigate the subtle hierarchies below stairs. Authority, earned through reliability and skill, eroded under the influence of alcohol. Decisions were delayed or forgotten. Timing faltered. Those once entrusted with responsibility became liabilities, observed closely by peers and supervisors alike. Their reputation, already precarious, deteriorated quickly. Despite these dangers, alcohol provided something irreplaceable. Moments of warmth, laughter, and camaraderie persisted in shared drinking, creating temporary reprieve from constant vigilance. A glass passed quietly between men could sustain morale, reinforce solidarity, or signal understanding without words. In these fleeting moments, humanity persisted beneath the weight of labor and expectation. Long-term effects were severe. Chronic drinking diminished health, altered behavior, and sometimes led to dismissal or disappearance. Employment opportunities narrowed. Peers learned from observation. Moderation ensured survival. Excess invited ruin. Blacklists and gossip magnified the consequences, spreading reputation like a shadow that extended beyond the immediate household. Even when men recovered temporarily, the cycle repeated. Fatigue, stress, and unrelenting labor drove them back to drink. Skill, endurance, and discretion could not fully counter the weight of exhaustion. The household's demands were constant. Relief, however brief, became a necessity, creating dependency that was rarely acknowledged and often quietly condemned. In the end, men who drank themselves away served as living reminders of the limits of endurance below stairs. Their bodies bore the consequences of labor, exhaustion, and inattention to risk. Their peers adjusted, endured, and watched, carrying lessons about moderation, discretion, and the precarious balance between survival and self-destruction. Even in excess, the invisible rules of the household dictated their fate, reinforcing hierarchy, obedience, and the enduring lesson: below stairs, indulgence could never be fully safe, and survival required constant vigilance. Some servants bore knowledge that exceeded what was safe to hold. They observed patterns, overheard confidences, and witnessed truths that others assumed were concealed. In the rigid hierarchy below stairs, such awareness was both power and peril. Knowledge, when unshared, could be a shield. When exposed, it became a weapon, capable of ruin. The servant who knew too much occupied a precarious space, balancing discretion against instinct, survival against temptation. The accumulation of knowledge was gradual. Long hours allowed observation of behaviors that others missed. The subtle exchanges of hands, whispered words, expressions fleeting and precise, the inconsistencies between words and actions. Servants noted these discrepancies silently, cataloguing detail after detail, storing information that could, if released, destabilize both peers and masters alike. Every corridor, pantry, and stairwell became a theater of observation, and the attentive servant a quiet archivist of household life. With knowledge came isolation. Awareness separated the observant from the unaware. Peers trusted instinctively, but suspicion hovered when one seemed to anticipate events, understand unseen dynamics, or act preemptively. Alliances were tested, subtle rivalries formed, and even friendships were filtered through the lens of what was known but unspoken. The servant who knew too much became simultaneously valuable and threatening. The danger was omnipresent. A misjudged comment, a glance interpreted wrongly, a hint revealed by mistake, these could expose the depth of awareness and provoke swift retribution. Dismissal, blacklisting, or worse could follow. The household above stairs was sensitive to threats to reputation and control. Those who observed too closely risked disruption of the delicate illusion of order. To speak was perilous. To remain silent, exhausting. This knowledge shaped action below stairs. The servant used it strategically, mitigating risk for peers, covering errors, and occasionally intervening to prevent disaster. A discreet warning, a subtle rearrangement of tasks, a timely adjustment in routine, these gestures allowed control without exposure. Discretion became a tool of survival, and silence a language of power. Yet the servant who knew too much carried the burden internally. Observation could not be shared freely. Confidences could not be expressed openly. Every revelation had to be weighed against consequences. Emotional labor compounded physical labor. Fatigue deepened by the constant tension of awareness. Knowledge became both gift and curse, offering insight while amplifying vulnerability. There were moments when the weight of knowledge became almost unbearable. Secrets about illness, misconduct, or scandal pressed heavily on the mind. Servants walked corridors with the careful neutrality of one carrying forbidden understanding. Their movements, expressions, and words were calibrated to avoid suspicion while maintaining functional awareness. The art of invisibility intensified in those who bore too much. The household relied unknowingly on these observant servants. Problems were prevented, tasks anticipated, errors corrected before they surfaced. Yet the same knowledge could not be acknowledged. Recognition might provoke envy, fear, or punishment. The balance of utility and risk defined their existence, shaping behavior and reinforcing discretion as both moral and practical imperative. In the end, the servant who knew too much survived by mastering silence, reading the currents of authority and hierarchy, and wielding knowledge invisibly. Their awareness sustained order, protected peers, and maintained household function, all while ensuring personal survival. Knowledge, in this invisible theater, was the quietest, sharpest, and most perilous form of power below stairs. Respectability was the currency of the household above stairs, maintained through polished surfaces, silent obedience, and carefully choreographed appearances. It demanded vigilance, performance, and sacrifice. Servants understood this instinctively. They were the unseen architects of propriety, laboring not only to complete tasks, but to ensure that the veneer of perfection remained unbroken, no matter the cost. The household's reputation was fragile. A single lapse could suggest disorder, impropriety, or moral weakness. Servants absorbed this pressure, understanding that their work was inseparable from the family's public face. Every action, from polishing silver to smoothing linens, contributed to a narrative of respectability that hid exhaustion, disagreement, and human vulnerability. They labored as much for concealment as for function. Tasks were performed with relentless precision. Floors gleamed, fires burned steadily, and meals appeared flawless. Windows were polished to remove traces of smoke. Curtains hung evenly, linens folded with geometric care. Each detail, observed only by the family or occasional guest, carried significance disproportionate to its apparent simplicity. The household judged order by what was seen, and servants ensured that every trace of labor appeared effortless. Sacrifice was intrinsic. Personal needs were subordinated to the household's image. Sleep was fragmented, meals hurried, illness endured in silence. Discomfort was tolerated without complaint. Emotional labor was constant, for servants were expected to mask fatigue, frustration, or grief while maintaining composure. Their bodies performed as instruments of presentation, their minds trained in vigilance and discretion. Even secrecy became a tool of respectability. Letters were burned, misdeeds concealed, indiscretions unspoken. Servants carried knowledge of errors, desires, or scandals that the family above stairs could not acknowledge. To reveal them would threaten order, undermining appearances meticulously maintained. In this way, labor below stairs extended into moral and social territory, safeguarding honor through silence. The cost of failure was high. A misplaced object, a misheard instruction, or a delayed task could ripple outward, undermining composure above stairs. Punishments were swift and often public within the household, reinforcing hierarchy and demonstrating that the preservation of respectability demanded obedience, diligence, and invisibility. Servants internalized this lesson, performing acts of labor and discretion as though their lives depended on it because, in practice, they often did. Friendship, alliance, and solidarity operated carefully within this framework. Peers supported one another subtly, covering mistakes, sharing knowledge, or intervening discreetly. These acts were necessary not only for survival but to uphold the household's integrity. When the family appeared calm and composed, it was as much a testament to unseen collaboration as to authority. Even death, illness, or scandal were managed to preserve appearance. Rooms were prepared, incidents explained away, and labor redistributed to prevent disruption. Servants bore responsibility for maintaining the facade, absorbing labor and grief simultaneously, ensuring that the household's respectability remained intact despite the hidden human cost. Ultimately, respectability was preserved through unbroken continuity. The household above stairs presented an image of order, calm, and moral rectitude. Servants maintained this illusion, performing, observing, and managing with precision, discretion, and sacrifice. The veneer of propriety was never accidental. It was crafted meticulously, at every hour, by those who remained unseen, ensuring that life above stairs appeared faultless while the truth below remained invisible. In this way, respectability demanded everything of servants: obedience, labor, discretion, and endurance. They became guardians of appearances, invisible yet essential, preserving the household's honor at any cost, sustaining a world of illusion while living a reality shaped by sacrifice, vigilance, and unacknowledged mastery. The life of a servant below stairs was a continuous thread of labor, vigilance, and invisibility, yet it left almost no record. Each day unfolded with the precision of routine and the pressure of expectation, a cycle of labor repeated endlessly under the scrutiny of those who would never fully acknowledge it. Tasks completed with care, discretion exercised with exactitude, knowledge preserved silently. These acts sustained the household, shaped its rhythm, and maintained its appearance, yet they remained invisible to the world above. Morning began with measured motion. Servants rose before the family, preparing rooms, fires, and meals. Every action was choreographed to be both efficient and unseen. The clatter of utensils, the swish of broom against floor, the subtle hum of activity, all orchestrated to maintain appearances, yet none of it recorded. Each gesture mattered, yet vanished almost immediately, absorbed into the continuing demands of labor. Observation became second nature. Servants noted patterns, remembered details, anticipated needs. Who slept lightly, who stirred restlessly, who required careful attention to prevent upset or scandal. Knowledge accumulated silently, shaping behavior, informing decisions, and sustaining the household's stability. Yet this awareness existed only in memory, unrecorded, unacknowledged, and impermanent. Friendships, alliances, and even romances were conducted in secret. Bonds were built through shared labor, whispered confidences, and fleeting gestures of kindness. Moments of intimacy or solidarity provided solace in the relentless routine, yet they remained undocumented. The household witnessed order, never the subtle acts of care, trust, or defiance that preserved it. Lives unfolded in parallel with the family's apparent stability, shaping human experience that was almost entirely invisible. Acts of survival were equally unrecorded. Servants concealed illness, adapted to exhaustion, navigated hierarchy, and protected one another through subtle interventions. Small rebellions, carefully executed, asserted agency in a system designed to minimize it. Mistakes were absorbed quietly, corrected without fanfare, and often blamed upon chance or circumstance rather than acknowledged as effort or judgment. Knowledge and skill operated in the shadows, sustaining continuity while erasing recognition. Even crises, pregnancy, injury, or sudden dismissal left only traces. Disappearances occurred silently. Absences recorded only as empty spaces in routine. Life-threatening circumstances were endured quietly, often without intervention, and their resolution absorbed into the rhythm of daily labor. The household's continuity masked the human cost, preserving appearances while obscuring reality. Memory became the only archive. Servants remembered faces, voices, gestures, errors, and triumphs. They recalled the rhythm of labor, the shared understanding between colleagues, the fleeting joys of clandestine intimacy, and the burdens of unseen responsibility. These memories were passed orally, sometimes through subtle teaching, cautionary tales, or coded gestures, but never formally recorded. The life below stairs existed almost entirely in recollection, intangible yet persistent. The household above remained unaware. To them, the work appeared effortless, the environment orderly, the lives of servants indistinct. Success was measured by absence of disruption, not by acknowledgement of effort. The labor, endurance, and human presence that sustained daily life remained invisible, leaving a profound gap between perception and reality. In the end, the life of a servant was a quiet testament to endurance, skill, and discretion. It was a human existence conducted in shadows, shaping and sustaining the world above while leaving almost no evidence. Every motion, every act, every thought was both essential and unrecorded, forming a hidden history that vanished with each day's end. And yet, in that invisibility lay its own power. The household survived, order persisted, and human resilience endured quietly, persistently, invisibly beyond record or recognition.